Sir, you need to move. This section is reserved for premium passengers. Those words cut through the cabin like a blade. At 35,000 feet, surrounded by luxury leather and crystal champagne flutes, Marcus Washington, billionaire, CEO, owner of 3 Fortune 500 companies, was being told he didn't belong. But here's what Skyline Airways flight attendant Sandra Mills didn't know. The man she was humiliating owned 47% of the airline she worked for. And in exactly 5 minutes, that mistake would cost them $500 million. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before anyone knew your name? Have you ever been told you don't belong in a space you paid to access? If this resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what you're about to witness will change how you think about respect, power, and the price of prejudice forever. The morning of Monday, March 15, 2024, started like any other at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The familiar symphony of rolling luggage departure announcements and hurried footsteps created the soundtrack of modern travel. Business travelers clutched their phones like lifelines. Vacation families herded children toward gates, and the eternal dance of commercial aviation continued its relentless rhythm. Marcus Washington moved through Terminal 4 with the measured pace of someone who owned time itself. At 45 years old, he had learned that true power dressed quietly when it wanted to observe truth. His dark jeans were well-fitted, but carried no designer labels. His navy polo shirt whispered quality without shouting status. His black leather loafers were polished but unremarkable. To casual observers, he looked like any other business traveler, comfortable, competent, but not particularly noteworthy. That anonymity was absolutely intentional. Marcus Washington's story began in Detroit's East Side, where his grandmother had mortgaged her small home to give her grandson a $500 loan and belief in possibilities that poverty couldn't kill. 23 years later, that loan had become Apex Industries, a $12 billion empire, spanning technology, real estate, and transportation. The journey had demanded 16-hour days, hostile takeovers, economic downturns, and navigating the casual racism that shadowed successful black executives like persistent weather. But every discrimination experience had become market research. Every assumption had generated insight into corporate cultures that prioritized comfort over competence, familiar over foreign. Each moment of bias had sharpened his understanding of how institutional prejudice operated behind policies, procedures, and professional smiles. 3 years ago, that research had identified Skyline Airways as an acquisition target with strong fundamentals, but market capitalization suggesting cultural challenges. Marcus had spent 36 months conducting due diligence, analyzing finances, studying operations, and most importantly, experiencing the company culture from inside. Today's flight was the final examination, not of profit margins, but of character. His boarding pass read, M. Walker, a legal alias protecting his privacy during the most critical phase of corporate evaluation. The reservation traced to a shell company, the credit card belonged to a trust, and his frequent flyer account used the Walker identity exclusively. For the next 8 hours, billionaire Marcus Washington would disappear, allowing anonymous passenger M. Walker to test how Skyline Airways treated customers when they believed no one powerful was watching. The $2.8 billion acquisition was scheduled to close Friday morning. Legal documents waited for final signatures. Financing agreements were executed. Regulatory approvals had been obtained, and integration teams stood ready. But Marcus insisted on this cultural assessment because he'd learned that companies revealed their true values, not in boardrooms or press releases, but in how they treated people they considered powerless. If Skyline Airways demonstrated respect for all passengers Regardless of appearance or status, they would join his empire and benefit from his philosophy of dignified service. If they failed this test, they would discover that assumptions carried consequences. Some companies couldn't survive. Flight 847 to London Heathrow represented Skyline Airways at its most polished. The Boeing 777-300ER gleamed with corporate pride, configured to maximize revenue from premium passengers while efficiently accommodating economy travelers. The aircraft embodied the airline industry's fundamental philosophy: service quality should correlate directly with ticket prices. The business class cabin occupied the front 8 rows, separated from economy by a curtain that functioned as both physical barrier and social boundary. 42 seats arranged in 2-2-2 configuration, each converting into fully flat beds for the 7-hour transatlantic journey. The seats wore butter-soft leather that cost more per square foot than most car payments. Walnut wood panels provided visual warmth, while LED lighting created artificial sunlight at any hour. Crystal stemware caught and reflected the cabin's carefully orchestrated ambiance. The air carried subtle signatures of wealth, expensive cologne, leather, conditioning, and that particular scent of money, a composition of premium materials, exclusive experiences, and confidence that never questioned belonging anywhere. As passengers settled into their seats, Marcus observed the familiar theater of altitude hierarchy. Conversations murmured about merger deals and summer houses, stock options, and private school admissions. They spoke in the coded language of inherited privilege, the house in the Hampton school, instead of naming elite academies the club, without specifying which country club. At the galley station, Sandra Mills distributed pre-departure champagne, with mechanical precision, developed through 15 years of premium service. Her blonde hair was pulled back in Skyline's regulation style, her uniform pressed to military specifications, her smile professionally calibrated. Sandra had built her career on what she called passenger intuition reading situations, quickly preventing problems, maintaining the serene atmosphere that business-class customers expected. Her personnel file documented consistent excellence, customer service awards, safety commendations, peer recognition for grace under pressure. She genuinely believed herself skilled at managing diverse personalities in confined spaces, spotting potential issues before they disrupted premium experiences. But her intuition had been shaped by years of unconscious pattern recognition that confused correlation with causation, familiarity with belonging, appearance with character. Behind Sandra, flight service manager James Crawford reviewed his tablet with focused intensity that had earned him promotion through Skyline's management ranks. At 51, his graying temples and expensive watch suggested someone who'd survived corporate restructurings through careful politics and unquestioned loyalty to company protocols. James prided himself on operational excellence. Premium passengers paid premium prices for premium experiences, and his responsibility was ensuring perfect service delivery, seamless logistics, elegant amenities, and exclusive atmosphere that justified the cost differential over economy seating. The third crew member, Tom Martinez, moved through the cabin with less certainty. At 26, he was relatively new to international premium service, having earned this prestigious assignment through excellent performance on domestic routes. His immigrant parents had worked multiple jobs to fund his education, and the airline industry offered opportunities for travel and advancement beyond their wildest dreams. But gratitude sometimes bred deference to authority that overwhelmed moral instincts. Tom had observed interactions that made him uncomfortable assumptions about passengers based on appearance-coded language, carrying racial implications, service decisions influenced by bias rather than policy. Yet speaking up meant risking career advancement, challenging experienced supervisors, potentially earning reputation as a troublemaker in an industry where relationships determined opportunities. So, Tom focused on his responsibilities: trusted senior staff judgment, and hoped uncomfortable situations would resolve themselves without requiring him to choose between conscience and career security. Seat 2A represented prime real estate in business class second row center, perfectly positioned for Marcus to observe crew dynamics while maintaining clear sight lines throughout the premium cabin. His boarding pass displayed the assignment. Clearly, confirmation email was saved on his phone. Identification was ready for any verification requests. But someone was already sitting there. The occupant appeared to be about 60, with silver hair styled expensively, and a charcoal suit bearing subtle signatures of bespoke tailoring. His platinum wedding band caught cabin lighting as he gestured at his phone, discussing stock portfolios in the casual tone of someone whose investment mistakes never threatened lifestyle or legacy. Italian leather shoes probably cost more than many passengers' monthly salaries. Marcus recognized Richard Blackstone immediately, third-generation venture capitalist whose railroad fortune had been compounding for over a century. Richard represented inherited wealth in its purest form. Privilege, so established, it felt like natural law rather than historical accident. He held a crystal tumbler containing premium scotch despite the 9:15 a.m. departure, suggesting either alcohol dependency or the kind of entitlement that ignored conventional social boundaries. Marcus checked his boarding pass again. Seat 2A. No ambiguity. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely, stepping into the aisle beside the row. His voice carried measured professionalism, developed through decades of corporate negotiations. "I believe that's my seat." Richard looked up with mild irritation, as if interrupted during crucial business. His eyes performed rapid assessment: casual clothes, single carry-on absence of obvious wealth signals. His expression shifted from annoyance to dismissive calculation. "I'm sorry." Richard's tone suggested surprise rather than apology. "Seat 2A. Marcus repeated, displaying his boarding pass. "That's my assignment." Richard didn't examine the document. Instead, his internal algorithm processed visual data and reached a conclusion that felt both logical and reasonable. Marcus didn't match his mental template for business-class passengers. "There must be some confusion," Richard said, returning attention to his phone. "I'm sure the crew can find you something more suitable toward the back." The word choice was surgical suitable, rather than available, implying Marcus's current position was inherently inappropriate, regardless of documentation. Around them, passengers began noticing the interaction. Margaret Chen in 1B looked up from her Wall Street Journal. A businessman in 3A paused his conversation to observe. The premium cabin's carefully maintained tranquility developed tiny stress fractures as attention focused on potential disruption. Marcus felt familiar weight settling in his chest. Not anger, yet, but recognition. He'd experienced this moment in country club dining rooms, where staff assumed he was there for job interviews rather than membership meetings. In luxury dealerships, where salespeople directed him toward used cars. In airport lounges, where attendants requested membership verification twice while waving white passengers through without question. Each incident had been individually manageable, but cumulatively exhausting. Each had also been educational, revealing unconscious assumptions that shaped institutional treatment of different demographic categories. The confusion, Marcus said quietly, emphasizing the word Richard had chosen, would be assuming I don't belong here based on appearance rather than documentation. The challenge was precise and unavoidable. Marcus wasn't arguing about seat assignments, he was exposing the presumption underlying Richard's dismissal. Richard's jaw tightened as he recognized his bias had been identified rather than accepted. Other passengers leaned forward imperceptibly, sensing this interaction might transcend typical travel inconveniences. That's when Sandra Mills approached, her professional smile already shifting from welcome to management mode. She had been monitoring the situation from her galley station, reading body language and facial expressions with practiced skill. Her radar detected multiple warning signals: expensive seat occupied by inappropriately dressed passenger, potential confrontation, developing premium cabin atmosphere threatened by emerging conflict. Her experience suggested an obvious solution: redirect the misplaced passenger to more appropriate accommodations, restore harmony to the premium section, maintain the exclusive environment that business-class customers deserved. "Is there an issue here, gentlemen?" Sandra asked, though her focus remained on Marcus, as if he were the inevitable source of any disruption. Richard gestured toward Marcus with his tumbler, the movement casual but dismissive. "This person seems confused about seating arrangements." Marcus noted the dehumanizing language, immediately person rather than gentleman, as Sandra had used. The linguistic distancing was subtle but unmistakable. Sandra nodded as if the situation was now clear still, without requesting Marcus's boarding pass, consulting her manifest, or following verification protocols that could have resolved everything in 30 seconds. Her assumptions felt like professional intuition, because they aligned with 15 years of pattern recognition. They seemed reasonable because they matched unconscious expectations about premium cabin demographics. They appeared customer-focused because they prioritized satisfaction for the passenger most likely to generate complaints. But Marcus had learned that assumptions were just prejudices wearing comfortable clothing of common sense. "I don't need anyone to resolve confusion that doesn't exist," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge of firmness. "I need to sit in the seat. I paid for the seat I was assigned. The seat clearly indicated on my valid boarding pass." He held up the document again, providing every opportunity for verification through facts rather than assumptions. But Sandra's mind had moved past problem-solving toward problem elimination. In her experience, passengers who insisted they belonged in premium cabins, when they clearly didn't, responded better to firm management than prolonged discussion. The confrontation that would destroy $500 million in market value was about to begin, triggered not by malicious intent, but by comfortable assumptions that had never been challenged or questioned. Marcus Washington settled back into his aisle position, prepared to let Skyline Airways corporate culture reveal itself as completely as their systems and training would allow. In 4 minutes, everyone involved would discover exactly what their comfortable biases actually cost. Sandra Mills stood in the business class aisle, her 15 years of premium cabin experience processing the situation through mental frameworks that had always served her well. She saw potential disruption requiring swift resolution, passenger confusion needing professional clarification, and cabin harmony threatened by someone who didn't understand the implicit rules of luxury travel. Her training emphasized reading passenger dynamics, preventing problems before they affected other customers' experiences, and maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that justified business class pricing. Every signal she was receiving suggested this situation required careful but firm management. Sir Sandra said, her voice carrying practiced authority, calibrated to establish control without appearing confrontational. "I can see there's been some confusion about seating arrangements. Why don't you come with me, and let me help get you settled more appropriately?" The word appropriately hung in the cabin air like a judicial verdict. Not correctly based on documentation, not comfortably based on preference, but appropriately according to some unstated standard that Marcus apparently violated. Marcus remained motionless in the aisle, his posture relaxed, but absolutely immovable. 15 years of hostile corporate negotiations had taught him the difference between genuine authority and performed control. "There's no confusion on my part," Marcus replied, his voice maintaining professional calm. "This is my assigned seat, confirmed by your airline's reservation system, documented by the boarding pass I'm holding, and verified by the identification in my wallet." His response was factual, reasonable, and completely accurate. But Sandra heard something different. Resistance to crew authority, unwillingness to accept professional judgment, the kind of stubborn insistence that could escalate into scenes that disrupted entire premium cabins. She had handled similar situations before, passengers with upgrade certificates or discounted business class fares, who didn't understand that premium service came with unwritten expectations about behavior, appearance, and deference to other customers' comfort preferences. I understand this might be disappointing. Sandra continued her tone, implying that Marcus's position was emotional rather than factual, but we've had some last-minute adjustments to cabin assignments. I can offer you an excellent alternative in our premium economy section. Complimentary upgrade with full meal service and priority baggage handling. The offer was presented as generous corporate accommodation, suggesting Sandra was exceeding normal customer service expectations to resolve an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Marcus recognized the underlying assumption that his original booking had been for economy class, that his presence in business class resulted from system error or unauthorized access. What adjustments, Marcus asked. Who authorized changing my confirmed reservation without notification or consent? The questions were logical and deserved straightforward answers. But they also challenged Sandra's authority to manage the situation, according to her professional judgment, questioned her expertise, and threatened to prolong a discussion she wanted, concluded quickly. Around them, passenger attention was consolidating into focused observation. Margaret Chen had set aside her newspaper entirely, watching with the sharp attention of someone recognizing familiar patterns. The businessman in 3A had ended his phone call to observe openly. Even passengers in rows behind were beginning to crane necks to see what was delaying pre-departure service. Sandra felt the weight of multiple eyes analyzing her handling of the situation. Premium cabin passengers expected seamless service, elegant problem resolution, and above all, protection from the kind of disruptions that reminded them they were sharing confined space with strangers whose behavior couldn't be completely controlled. Richard Blackstone swirled his scotch and sighed with theatrical impatience. Look, I don't want to be unreasonable, but I have a video conference with Tokyo investors in exactly 18 minutes. This whole situation could be resolved very quickly if everyone just accepted reality and moved forward appropriately. His language was carefully chosen to sound reasonable while communicating clear expectations. Marcus should accept reality. He didn't belong. Move forward to economy and do so appropriately without further argument. The implicit message was unmistakable. Marcus's insistence on equal treatment was creating problems for passengers who actually mattered. Marcus studied both Sandra and Richard with analytical intensity that had served him through billion-dollar negotiations. He could read power dynamics, distinguish genuine authority from theatrical performance, and recognize manufactured crises designed to justify predetermined outcomes. Reality, Marcus said, his voice carrying quiet precision, is that I have documented proof of my right to occupy this seat while you have assumptions based on my appearance. Which of those seems more reliable as a foundation for decision-making? The question was a trap that exposed the fundamental weakness in their position. Sandra couldn't acknowledge that her judgment was based on appearance rather than policy without admitting to discrimination. Richard couldn't defend his dismissal without revealing the prejudiced assumptions driving his expectations. Margaret Chen leaned forward in her seat, her judicial training immediately recognizing the logical structure Marcus was constructing. 25 years on the federal bench had taught her to identify discrimination, even when it disguised itself as customer service or operational necessity. "Excuse me, Margaret," said her voice carrying courtroom authority, developed through decades of managing lawyers who thought they could mislead federal judges. "I've been observing this entire interaction. This gentleman has been completely professional and reasonable. The only source of tension I've witnessed has been staff members making assumptions about who belongs where, based on appearance rather than documentation." Her intervention transformed the dynamic completely. Margaret Chen wasn't just another passenger questioning crew judgment. She was a federal judge with professional expertise in recognizing and analyzing discriminatory practices. Her credibility gave weight to observations that Sandra might dismiss from other sources. Sandra turned toward Margaret with professional courtesy that barely concealed rising frustration. Another problem: passenger questioning established procedures, potentially creating exactly the kind of public challenge to authority that could spiral into complaints to corporate headquarters. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is an operational matter requiring crew discretion. We're trained to handle these situations according to established protocols." Margaret's eyebrows rose at the phrase, "established protocols." Her courtroom experience had taught her to recognize euphemisms designed to make discriminatory practices sound neutral and professional. "What protocols?" Margaret asked, her voice taking on prosecutorial sharpness. "The protocol that assumes black passengers don't belong in premium seats. The protocol that prioritizes white comfort over civil rights compliance. Because those aren't operational procedures, they're violations of federal anti-discrimination law." The word discrimination detonated in the premium cabin like a carefully placed explosive charge, transforming casual passenger interest into laser-focused attention. Conversations stopped mid-word. Phones appeared as travelers began documenting what might become legally significant evidence. The exclusive atmosphere that business-class passengers expected began fracturing into something far more volatile and revealing. Sandra felt control of the situation evaporating faster than she could adapt her response strategy. She had anticipated routine passenger compliance, the familiar dance of mild protest, followed by grudging acceptance of airline authority. Federal judges discussing civil rights violations, while other passengers recorded everything, had never appeared in her crisis management training. "Let me get my supervisor," Sandra announced, reaching for the intercom button, with fingers that trembled slightly from adrenaline. "Flight Service Manager Crawford can clarify company policies and resolve the situation appropriately." Marcus nodded with an expression approaching satisfaction, not smugness or triumph, but the quiet confidence of someone who had predicted exactly this escalation and was prepared to let institutional systems reveal themselves completely. "Excellent idea," he said calmly. "Let's get all the appropriate people involved in clarifying all the relevant policies." James Crawford had built his career on operational excellence and passenger satisfaction scores that consistently ranked among Skyline's highest. When Sandra's urgent message reached him, he was reviewing the business class manifest for potential issues that might complicate the international flight. The passenger list showed typical demographics: corporate executives, wealthy retirees, and several passengers whose premium seat purchases might require diplomatic handling if they didn't understand the behavioral expectations that came with expensive tickets. James approached the situation with confidence developed through managing hundreds of similar conflicts. The key was projecting authority while offering solutions that allowed all parties to save face, resolving problems through professional competence rather than confrontation. "Good morning, everyone," James said, as he reached row 2, his voice carrying practiced warmth that had earned customer service recognition throughout his career. "I'm James Crawford, your flight service manager. Sandra mentioned we might have a seating question that needs attention." Marcus looked up with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to boardroom negotiations, where billions of dollars moved on personal credibility and professional reputation. "No question from my perspective," Marcus replied. "I'm sitting exactly where Skyline Airways assigned me to sit." James consulted his tablet, frowning, as he scrolled through screens in what appeared to be thorough review of official documentation. The performance was carefully choreographed. He hadn't actually accessed Marcus's reservation or verified any seating information, but the gesture would lend authority to whatever solution he proposed. "Mr." James paused expectantly. "Walker. M. Walker." James nodded, as if the name confirmed information in his system. "Mr. Walker, I can see how this situation developed. While your boarding pass does show seat 2A, we've received some special accommodation requests from other passengers that require slight adjustments to our cabin configuration. Margaret Chen recognized the verbal gymnastics immediately. Passive voice to obscure responsibility. Vague references to requests and adjustments to avoid identifying specific actors or acknowledging discriminatory motivations. The language was identical to what she'd heard from defense attorneys trying to justify unjustifiable positions. What kind of special requests? Marcus asked with genuine curiosity that concealed strategic intent. James had walked directly into another carefully constructed trap. Answering honestly would mean admitting that passenger comfort preferences were being prioritized over confirmed reservations. Avoiding the question would reveal that his explanations were manufactured rather than factual, the kind that help us maintain optimal passenger experiences and cabin harmony for everyone traveling with us today. James replied, deploying meaningless corporate language designed to sound reasonable while saying nothing specific. Margaret Chen almost laughed at the transparently evasive response. Optimal passenger experiences for whom? Cabin harmony. Prioritizing whose comfort? Because it seems like you're optimizing for some passengers at the expense of others. James felt the conversation shifting into territory that hadn't been covered in his customer service training. Federal judges asking pointed questions about discrimination, while other passengers documented everything created legal and public relations risks that standard conflict resolution techniques couldn't address. I'm prepared to offer Mr. Walker an excellent alternative accommodation, James announced, trying to regain control through generous-sounding solutions. Seat 12A in our premium economy section with complimentary meal service, priority baggage handling, and a voucher for future travel. It's actually a significant upgrade that most passengers would find very appealing. The offer was presented as corporate magnanimity, but Marcus heard all the assumptions it contained, that his original booking had been for economy class, that he should be grateful for upgrades to accommodate other passengers' preferences, that accepting relegation would benefit everyone involved. Upgrade from what original booking? Marcus asked. You haven't examined my reservation. You don't know what I paid or what accommodations I purchased. You're making assumptions about my ticket status. Based on what criteria exactly? The precision of the question exposed the fundamental flaw in James's approach. He was managing appearance and assumptions rather than facts and documentation. But acknowledging that would mean admitting his decisions were based on discriminatory visual profiling. Instead, James doubled down on institutional authority, the corporate shield that protected airline employees from having to justify judgment calls to passengers. Mr. Walker, I've been managing premium cabin operations for 15 years. I have comprehensive understanding of these situations and full discretionary authority to make seating adjustments that ensure the best possible travel experience for our most valued customers. The phrase, most valued customers, detonated like a second explosive in the increasingly tense cabin atmosphere. The implication was unmistakable. Marcus was not among the passengers whose satisfaction mattered most, whose preferences took priority, whose complaints could damage corporate reputation. Margaret Chen leaned forward with the expression she reserved for attorneys who thought they could mislead her court. Most valued customers. Are you stating for the record that this passenger is less valued than others? That his rights and comfort are subordinate to other people's preferences? James realized he was being cross-examined by someone with professional expertise in exposing discriminatory practices and policies. But retreating would mean acknowledging that his entire approach had been based on bias rather than legitimate operational considerations. I'm stating that we have established procedures for managing passenger concerns and maintaining cabin environments that meet the expectations of all our customers. When situations develop that could affect the travel experience, we have both the authority and responsibility to make appropriate adjustments. What situation has Mr. Walker created? Marcus interjected, his voice remaining calm, but gaining steel undertones. I haven't disrupted anyone. I haven't violated any stated policies. I haven't raised my voice or made demands. The only situation here is your assumption that I don't belong in a seat I legally purchased and was officially assigned. The accuracy of Marcus's observation created uncomfortable silence throughout the premium cabin. Other passengers shifted restlessly, some looking away from the confrontation, others openly staring at institutional discrimination being documented in real time. Richard Blackstone, who had been trying to maintain plausible distance from the direct conflict while finishing his scotch, decided that subtle authority had failed and direct assertion was required. "Look," he said, his voice carrying the casual entitlement of inherited wealth. "Some people just don't understand the social dynamics of premium travel environments. It's not about discrimination. It's about maintaining standards and atmosphere that premium passengers have legitimate rights to expect." His words were chosen to avoid explicitly racial language while communicating unmistakable discriminatory intent. The message was clear. Marcus's presence disrupted social hierarchies. His insistence on equal treatment violated established norms, and his refusal to accept subordinate status was the real source of cabin tension. Margaret Chen stared at Richard with the expression she typically reserved for criminals, showing no remorse for their actions. Social dynamics. Standards. Are you seriously arguing that commercial aircraft should enforce class systems based on passengers' appearance rather than their tickets and legal rights? Richard backpedaled slightly, recognizing his language had been more explicit than strategic. "I'm talking about natural social expectations that develop in luxury service environments. People with extensive experience in premium travel understand implicit behavioral norms that others might not fully appreciate." The explanation was worse than his original statement, adding condescension about Marcus's supposed sophistication deficit to the underlying discrimination. But it also revealed the comfortable assumptions that enabled systematic bias to operate behind facades of customer service excellence. Alex Rivera. A 28-year-old tech entrepreneur seated in 3C had been discreetly recording the interaction since James's arrival. His finger hovered over the Go Live button on his social media app, recognizing that this confrontation was transforming from individual customer service failure into something with broader social significance. Marcus absorbed Richard's words with something approaching scientific fascination. This wasn't just personal prejudice. It was institutional culture revealing its actual values through the comfortable assumptions of people who had never imagined their biases could carry financial consequences. Tom Martinez stood frozen near the galley, watching his supervisors construct a discrimination case that employment lawyers would use as textbook examples of systematic bias in action. His training had included detailed sessions about avoiding exactly these kinds of assumptions and language patterns. But speaking up meant challenging authority, questioning experienced managers, potentially destroying his career prospects in an industry where reputation determined advancement opportunities. So he remained silent, hating himself for moral cowardice, while prioritizing economic survival over ethical courage. James Crawford felt the situation spiraling beyond conventional customer service solutions into territory that threatened both operational control and legal exposure. Federal judges were documenting discrimination, passengers were recording evidence, and social media was beginning to transform private conflict into public controversy. Time to invoke ultimate authority. Federal aviation security regulations that gave flight crews broad discretionary power to remove passengers deemed threatening to safety, security, or operational efficiency. Post-9/11 legal frameworks had created extensive protections for crew decisions, making it extremely difficult for passengers to challenge removal orders, even when motivated by discriminatory bias. Mr. Walker. James announced, his voice taking on official gravity, designed to invoke federal authority. Your continued refusal to accept reasonable crew instructions, constitutes potential noncompliance with federal aviation regulations. Under Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, passengers are required to follow all lawful crew member directives for safety and security purposes. The legal citation was accurate but misleadingly applied. Federal regulations did require passenger compliance with crew instructions, but only when those instructions were lawful, reasonable, and necessary for legitimate operational purposes. Crew members couldn't invoke federal authority to enforce personal preferences or discriminatory policies disguised as customer service. But most passengers lacked legal sophistication to challenge regulatory citations, and many would accept crew authority rather than risk criminal charges, flight bans, or arrest by federal marshals. Marcus recognized the escalation as a strategic gambit, an attempt to criminalize civil rights resistance through selective interpretation of aviation law. He had encountered similar tactics in corporate litigation, where opponents tried to reframe legitimate business practices as regulatory violations. Which crew instruction am I violating? Marcus asked, his voice maintaining analytical calm that suggested legal familiarity rather than passenger intimidation. The instruction to abandon a seat I legally purchased. The instruction to accept discrimination for other passengers' comfort. Please cite the specific federal regulation that requires compliance with unlawful crew orders based on racial assumptions. The precision of Marcus's response revealed sophistication that caught James completely off guard. Most passengers confronted with federal citations became defensive or compliant, not analytical and challenging. Marcus's comfort with regulatory language suggested legal experience that could complicate attempts to invoke questionable authority. Margaret Chen leaned forward with renewed professional interest. Federal aviation law intersected with civil rights protections in complex ways that most airline employees didn't understand, but federal judges certainly did. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice carrying prosecutorial edge, "are you seriously claiming that federal law requires passengers to accept racial discrimination because that would directly contradict multiple Supreme Court precedents and federal civil rights statutes that take precedence over airline operational preferences?" Her intervention transformed the legal dynamics completely. James was no longer managing an isolated passenger who could be intimidated by regulatory language. He was facing a federal judge who understood exactly how aviation authority intersected with constitutional protections and had professional credibility to challenge his interpretation publicly. But James had committed too deeply to his approach to retreat without admitting that his entire strategy had been based on discrimination rather than legitimate safety concerns. Institutional momentum demanded doubling down on authority rather than acknowledging error. "Ma'am, while I respect your legal background, flight operations are governed by specific federal aviation authorities that may supersede other considerations during active aircraft operations. When passenger behavior creates cabin tension or disrupts the travel environment, we have both authority and responsibility to take corrective action." Margaret's expression shifted to open disbelief. 25 years on the federal bench had not prepared her for an airline employee lecturing her about federal law while simultaneously misinterpreting it to justify systematic discrimination. Flight Operations Authority does not include power to violate civil rights, she said, her voice taking the sharp edge reserved for lawyers attempting to mislead her court. Federal aviation regulations explicitly require that crew instructions be both lawful and reasonable. Ordering a passenger to accept racial discrimination satisfies neither criterion. Around the cabin, passengers were witnessing unprecedented legal drama. A federal judge providing real-time constitutional analysis of airline discrimination, while crew members violated civil rights law on camera in front of thousands of live viewers. Alex Rivera's live stream had attracted over 8,000 viewers, with comments flooding faster than he could read them. Someone had identified this as a Skyline Airways flight, and the airline's social media mentions were spiking with overwhelmingly negative sentiment. "This is insane," typed one viewer. "They're literally discriminating on live video. Someone needs to identify these crew members," wrote another. "This is federal crime territory." The viral mechanics of social media were transforming individual experience into collective outrage, amplifying Marcus's treatment beyond the aircraft cabin into global conversation about institutional discrimination. Sandra Mills noticed phones pointed in their direction and felt panic building in her chest. Customer service training had emphasized camera awareness and the assumption that every interaction could become public relations material. But her preparation had focused on positive scenarios: grateful passengers accepting generous solutions, smooth recovery from minor problems, elegant resolution of temporary inconveniences. She had no framework for managing discrimination accusations while being live-streamed to thousands of viewers whose comments were becoming increasingly supportive of the passenger being mistreated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sandra announced to the cabin, her voice carrying artificial authority that masked growing desperation, "federal safety regulations require that all personal electronic devices be secured during crew operational discussions. Please turn off all phones and cameras immediately." The demand was legally meaningless. No federal regulation prohibited passenger use of electronic devices during crew-passenger conversations, but Sandra was grasping for any mechanism that might stop documentation of their handling of the situation. Margaret Chen looked at Sandra with expression approaching judicial contempt. "There are no safety regulations being discussed here, and you have absolutely no authority to prevent passengers from documenting potential civil rights violations. Are you now attempting to silence witnesses to discrimination by invoking fabricated federal regulations?" The question exposed Sandra's attempted manipulation as both legally invalid and ethically corrupt. Other passengers began murmuring about crew willingness to lie about federal law to protect themselves from accountability. But the most damaging revelation was still coming. Richard Blackstone, feeling emboldened by what he perceived as crew support for his worldview, decided to voice explicitly what everyone was apparently thinking, but lacked courage to state directly. Honestly, he said his voice loud enough for multiple rows to hear clearly. This entire situation could have been avoided if people simply understood appropriate social boundaries. It's not about racism. It's about recognizing that certain passengers belong in certain sections, and pretending otherwise creates exactly this kind of unnecessary disruption. His words were carefully structured to avoid explicitly racial language while communicating unmistakably discriminatory intent. The message was clear. Marcus's presence violated natural social orders. His insistence on equal treatment disrupted established hierarchies, and his refusal to accept subordinate status was the fundamental source of conflict. The silence that followed was both profound and revealing. No crew member challenged Richard's characterization. No passenger contradicted his assessment. The absence of opposition became its own statement about who belonged and who didn't, whose comfort mattered and whose dignity was negotiable. Marcus remained standing in the aisle, surrounded by the institutional silence that enabled systematic discrimination, finally witnessing Skyline Airways corporate culture in its completely unfiltered form. This wasn't about individual prejudice or isolated bias. It was about systems designed to make exactly these distinctions policies that prioritized certain passengers over others, and training that had equipped crew members to recognize and respond to coded signals about who deserved premium treatment. Tom Martinez watched from the galley with growing horror as his supervisors constructed a textbook case of employment discrimination, while being recorded by multiple passengers whose live streams were reaching thousands of viewers in real time. Every word, every assumption, every policy justification was being documented as evidence of systematic institutional bias. He thought about speaking up about challenging the fundamental assumptions driving his colleagues' decisions, about pointing out that Marcus's behavior had been exemplary throughout an incident that had revealed the worst aspects of airline culture. But career survival instincts battled moral courage, and survival was winning decisively. So Tom Martinez remained silent, choosing economic security over ethical responsibility, personal advancement over collective justice, comfortable complicity over uncomfortable truth-telling. The aircraft remained parked at the gate, its departure delayed by an incident that had transformed routine customer service into a comprehensive demonstration of how institutional discrimination operated through policies, procedures, and comfortable assumptions that had never been challenged or questioned. James Crawford understood that conventional customer service recovery techniques had failed completely to contain the expanding crisis. Federal judges were providing real-time legal analysis of discrimination. Passengers were live-streaming evidence to growing audiences, and social media was amplifying the story beyond the controllable environment of the aircraft cabin into global conversation about institutional racism in corporate America. Conventional authority had proven insufficient. Time to invoke the nuclear option federal aviation security protocols that gave flight crews nearly unlimited discretionary power to remove passengers characterized as threats to safety security or operational integrity. Mr. Walker James announced, his voice carrying new official gravity, calculated to invoke maximum institutional authority. Your continued refusal to comply with reasonable crew instructions now constitutes a potential security concern under federal aviation regulations. When passengers demonstrate non-compliant behavior patterns, we are required by law to assess and address potential risks to flight safety and passenger security. The reframing was both strategic and systematic, drawing on post-9/11 security frameworks that prioritized crew authority over passenger rights in almost all circumstances. What had begun as customer service discrimination was being weaponized through federal regulations that made challenging crew decisions extremely difficult, even when those decisions were motivated by bias rather than legitimate security concerns. Marcus recognized the escalation as a desperate attempt to criminalize civil rights resistance through manipulation of aviation law. He had encountered identical tactics in hostile corporate environments, where opponents manufactured legal pretexts for actions they couldn't justify through normal channels. Security concern. Marcus repeated, his voice maintaining professional composure that suggested legal sophistication rather than passenger intimidation. Please describe specifically what behavior I've demonstrated that constitutes a threat to anyone's safety or security. Quote the exact words I've spoken or actions I've taken that justify federal security intervention. The challenge was precisely calibrated because Marcus's conduct throughout the entire incident had been a masterclass in controlled professionalism. He had never raised his voice, never used threatening language, never made aggressive gestures, never violated any stated policy or reasonable instruction. His resistance to discrimination had been expressed through dignified persistence rather than confrontational behavior. Alex Rivera's live stream had attracted over 12,000 viewers, with comments flowing so rapidly they created a digital waterfall of real-time reaction to institutionalized discrimination being documented in high definition. How is sitting quietly a security threat? Typed one viewer. This is the calmest, dangerous person I've ever seen, wrote another. Screenshot everything. This is evidence, commanded a third. The viral nature of social media was transforming individual injustice into collective witness, creating permanent documentation that would outlast any corporate damage control attempts. Margaret Chen pulled out her own phone, but instead of recording video, she began typing detailed notes with the precision of someone documenting evidence for future federal proceedings. As a sitting judge, she understood that discrimination cases often turned on exact documentation of what was said by whom and when, and her professional credibility could provide unshakable testimony about the systematic nature of what she was witnessing. For the record, she announced clearly enough for all recording devices to capture Mr. Walker has demonstrated remarkable composure throughout this entire interaction. The only threatening or disruptive behavior I've witnessed has come from airline personnel attempting to justify increasingly desperate accusations against a passenger whose only offense is declining to accept discrimination gracefully. Tom Martinez felt physically nauseated as he watched his supervisors construct federal charges against a passenger whose behavior had been exemplary, while their own conduct violated both company policy and federal law. His diversity training had covered exactly these scenarios, emphasizing that crew authority couldn't be used to enforce personal biases or accommodate discriminatory passenger preferences. But challenging his supervisors meant risking his career, questioning experienced managers, whose recommendations would determine his advancement prospects, potentially earning reputation as someone who couldn't support team decisions during challenging operational situations. The internal conflict was tearing him apart, but economic necessity won over moral courage. He remained silent, choosing job security over justice, personal advancement over passenger protection, comfortable complicity over uncomfortable truth-telling that could cost him everything he'd worked to achieve. Sandra Mills felt the situation careening beyond any framework her training had provided. Discrimination. Accusations. Federal judges, viral live streams, and social media outrage had never appeared in customer service scenarios or crisis management exercises. Her attempts to regain control were only accelerating the documentation of systematic bias. Sir, your hostile attitude toward reasonable crew instructions is creating an unsafe environment for other passengers, she said, grasping for language that might justify the escalating response. Federal regulations require us to prioritize passenger safety over individual preferences when conflicts develop that could threaten flight security. The accusation was absurd on multiple levels. Marcus had demonstrated no hostility. His responses had been more professional than those of the crew members accusing him. His attitude toward reasonable instructions was entirely appropriate, since the instructions weren't reasonable, but were discriminatory demands disguised as operational necessity. But Sandra was deploying the same post-9/11 security frameworks that had given airline personnel broad authority to remove passengers for almost any behavior that could be characterized as disruptive, non-compliant, or threatening to other travelers' comfort and safety. Marcus looked around the cabin at passengers who were witnessing institutional discrimination being justified through manufactured security concerns, federal authority being invoked to protect bias rather than safety, and corporate power being used to silence civil rights resistance rather than address civil rights violations. Miss Mills, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority that seemed to fill the cabin space. I want to make sure I understand your position clearly. You're stating that my polite refusal to accept racial discrimination constitutes a security threat that justifies federal intervention. The question was a legal trap that exposed the complete absence of legitimate justification for crew actions. Answering honestly would mean admitting that discrimination was being enforced through security protocols. Avoiding the question would reveal that security concerns were manufactured rather than genuine. Richard Blackstone, who had been observing the escalating confrontation with growing satisfaction, decided that official crew support justified expressing his views more explicitly. The real security issue here, he announced, his voice carrying alcohol-enhanced confidence, is passengers who refuse to accept appropriate social arrangements in premium cabins. When people insist on occupying spaces they're not suited for, it creates exactly this kind of tension and disruption that affects everyone else's travel experience. His language was still coded, but increasingly transparent. Appropriate social arrangements meant racial segregation. Spaces they're not suited for meant premium accommodations that should be reserved for white passengers. Tension and disruption meant the discomfort wealthy white travelers felt when forced to acknowledge black passengers as equals. Margaret Chen turned in her seat to face Richard directly, her judicial training immediately recognizing language patterns that revealed discriminatory intent despite careful word choice. Social arrangements, she said, her voice carrying prosecutorial precision. Are you arguing that airlines should enforce racial segregation based on your personal comfort preferences? Because that's what you're describing, and it's been federal crime since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Richard's face flushed as he realized his carefully coded language had been decoded by someone with professional expertise in recognizing discrimination disguised as neutral policy. But alcohol and entitlement overcame strategic caution. I'm not talking about race, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm talking about maintaining standards and atmosphere that premium passengers have legitimate rights to expect when they pay for exclusive service. Margaret leaned forward with the expression she reserved for witnesses caught lying under oath. Standards based on what criteria? Atmosphere excluding whom specifically? Because if your comfort requires this gentleman's absence, despite his valid ticket and exemplary behavior, then your expectations are both illegal and morally indefensible. The exchange was being captured by multiple recording devices, documented by thousands of live stream viewers, and preserved permanently in digital formats that would outlast any corporate damage control efforts. Richard Blackstone was creating evidence of discriminatory intent that civil rights lawyers would use for years as examples of how prejudice operated in premium service environments. James Crawford realized the situation had spiraled completely beyond recovery through conventional customer service techniques. Multiple passengers were documenting systematic discrimination. A federal judge was providing legal analysis in real time, and social media was transforming the incident into national conversation about institutional racism. I'm going to call for security assistance, he announced, reaching for the phone that connected directly to airport law enforcement. Mr. Walker's non-compliance with crew instructions requires professional intervention from trained security personnel. The threat was designed to force immediate compliance through fear of arrest, criminal charges, and physical removal by armed officers. Most passengers, when confronted with police involvement, would accept any accommodation, rather than risk detention and prosecution. But Marcus smiled the same calm, knowing expression that had unsettled Sandra from the beginning. It was the expression of someone who had predicted exactly this escalation and was prepared to let institutional discrimination reveal itself completely through its own systems and procedures. Please do call security, he said, his voice carrying quiet confidence that puzzled everyone within hearing range. Call your supervisor as well. Call whoever you believe needs to be involved in this situation. Let's make sure everyone who should be documenting this interaction has the opportunity to witness it firsthand. The response was the opposite of what James had expected. Instead of backing down under threat of arrest, Marcus was encouraging maximum official involvement, welcoming additional scrutiny, practically demanding that more authorities participate in what was becoming increasingly well-documented evidence of systematic institutional discrimination. As James began dialing, Alex Rivera's live stream crossed 15,000 viewers. Someone in the chat had posted Skyline Airways stock ticker symbol, and others were already sharing clips across Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook with hashtags like Skyline Shame, Airline Racism, and Justice at 30,000 feet. Corporate communications departments were about to discover that their Tuesday morning had become exponentially more complicated than quarterly earnings reports or operational updates. The phone call that would destroy $500 million in market value was now less than 5 minutes away. But first, Marcus Washington was going to demonstrate exactly what happened when institutional power revealed its true nature completely, when comfortable assumptions encountered someone with resources to impose immediate consequences, and when discrimination faced someone who understood that justice required accountability rather than acceptance. The most expensive customer service failure in aviation history was about to begin with a simple phone call that would teach an entire industry what civil rights violations actually cost when imposed on people with power to make that cost immediate and unavoidable. Airport Security Office, B7, felt like bureaucratic purgatory, fluorescent lighting that drained color from everything, institutional furniture designed for discomfort, and the particular odor of government buildings everywhere. Marcus Washington sat in one of the plastic chairs, with perfect composure, his messenger bag at his feet, his dignity completely intact, despite the humiliating escort from Flight 847 30 minutes earlier. The two Port Authority officers who had responded to Skyline Airways passenger removal request were professional but increasingly confused by the disconnect between their expectations and reality. Officer Martinez, unrelated to the flight attendant, had anticipated encountering a disruptive passenger, someone intoxicated, or belligerent, or threatening. Instead, he was interviewing a soft-spoken businessman who seemed more interested in making phone calls than protesting his treatment. "Let me make absolutely sure I understand what happened," Officer Martinez said, consulting the incident report Sandra Mills had completed. "You were sitting in your assigned seat. You never raised your voice or used threatening language. You made no aggressive gestures toward crew or passengers, and they called us because you declined to move from business class to economy." Marcus nodded calmly. "That's completely accurate." Officer Martinez exchanged glances with his partner, Officer Chen, who was running Marcus's identification through law enforcement databases. The search results were generating more questions than answers, and her expression suggested she was discovering information that didn't match typical passenger removal scenarios. "Mr. Washington," Officer Martinez said, reading the name from the driver's license. "The flight manifest listed you as M. Walker. I travel under legal aliases for privacy and security reasons," Marcus explained patiently. "Walker is an authorized pseudonym I use for business travel. I can provide documentation verifying the identity relationship if necessary." Officer Chen looked up from her computer terminal with an expression that had shifted from routine professionalism to something approaching amazement. "Marcus Washington, Chief Executive Officer of Apex Industries. Forbes estimates net worth at $2.8 billion. Multiple corporate addresses, including Manhattan headquarters, Detroit manufacturing facilities, and Los Angeles tech operations." The security office fell completely silent, except for the fluorescent light humming overhead. Officer Martinez stared at the identification, then at Marcus, then at his partner, processing implications that transformed this from routine passenger services into something historically significant. "Mr. Washington," Officer Martinez said carefully, his tone shifting to respectful formality, reserved for people who could purchase airports without affecting their quarterly budgets. "I believe there may have been a very serious misunderstanding in this situation." Marcus smiled genuinely, for the first time since boarding Flight 847. "Yes, I think that's quite an understatement. Would you like us to contact the flight crew immediately? This seems like something that should be resolved with appropriate apologies and immediate restoration to your correct seat." Marcus shook his head politely. "That won't be necessary, though. I appreciate the offer. However, I would very much like to make a phone call." Officer Martinez gestured toward the desk phone mounted on the wall. "Of course, sir. Please take whatever time you need." Marcus pulled out his personal cell phone instead, scrolling through contacts to find one labeled Catherine, Protocol 7. The call connected after exactly 2 rings. "Catherine, it's Marcus." Catherine Williams had been Marcus's executive assistant for 8 years, recruited directly from Harvard Business School, where she'd graduated summa cum laude, with concentrations in corporate finance and strategic management. She was exceptionally intelligent, operationally brilliant, and one of the few people in his organization who understood the complete architecture of his business empire. More importantly, she was one of only 3 people who knew exactly what Protocol 7 meant and why it had been created. Marcus Catherine's voice carried immediate concern and mobilization energy. "I've been monitoring news alerts and social media. There are reports about an incident on your flight, and I'm seeing viral videos that appear to show discrimination. Are you safe? Do you need immediate legal support or security assistance?" "I'm physically fine," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had just made a decision that would reshape multiple industries. "But I need you to initiate Protocol 7 immediately." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 6 seconds, while Catherine processed the full implications of what Marcus had requested. Protocol 7 was the nuclear option complete and irreversible withdrawal from the Skyline Airways acquisition, triggered only if due diligence revealed cultural or operational problems so fundamentally toxic that the target company didn't deserve to survive in its current form. Catherine understood that Marcus wouldn't invoke Protocol 7 casually or emotionally. She also understood that once the withdrawal machinery began operating, it would be impossible to stop. The legal and financial mechanisms had been designed for irreversible execution, precisely because walking away from $2.8 billion required absolute certainty and total commitment. "Marcus, that's $2.8 billion in committed capital," Catherine said, her fingers already accessing encrypted servers that contained Protocol 7 implementation procedures. "Once we trigger the withdrawal sequences, there's no reversal mechanism. The market impact will be catastrophic, not just for Skyline, but potentially for the entire aviation sector. Are you completely certain about this decision?" Marcus looked around the sterile government office, thinking about Sandra Mills's comfortable assumptions, James Crawford's manufactured security concerns, Richard Blackstone's casual entitlement, and the systematic nature of institutional discrimination he had experienced. This wasn't individual prejudice that could be corrected through training or policy adjustments. It was embedded corporate culture that enabled and protected bias through official procedures and unofficial understanding. "I'm certain," Marcus said. "They just demonstrated exactly why this company doesn't deserve to exist in its current form, and why attempting to reform it from within would be both impossible and morally compromised." Catherine's voice carried the focused intensity of someone coordinating complex financial warfare. "Execution timeline: immediate. Complete equity. Withdrawal debt. Facility termination. Partnership agreement. Cancellation. And vendor contract suspension. All actions simultaneous at market opening tomorrow morning. Every decision fully documented with comprehensive explanations of our withdrawal rationale." Catherine was already accessing legal documents that had been prepared theoretically, but never expected to be deployed practically. The market reaction will be devastating for them. Stock price collapse, credit rating downgrades, potential bankruptcy proceedings if they can't service debt obligations without our financial backing. This will send shockwaves through every major airline in North America. Marcus walked to the small window that overlooked JFK's runways, watching Skyline Airways aircraft taxi in their familiar blue and silver livery, unaware that their corporate existence hung in the balance of this conversation. Then perhaps the entire airline industry needs to examine its cultural foundations and operational priorities, Marcus replied. Perhaps systemic change requires systematic consequences rather than individual corrections. Officer Martinez, who had been trying not to eavesdrop, but couldn't avoid overhearing fragments of what appeared to be financial warfare being conducted from a government break room, began to understand that he was witnessing something that would be studied in business schools and law schools for decades. A $2.8 billion corporate acquisition was being terminated because of discrimination in premium cabin seating. Catherine continued coordinating the financial mechanisms that would devastate Skyline Airways within hours. I'll need to notify legal teams, investment bankers, regulatory compliance officers, and media relations specialists. SEC disclosure requirements mandate detailed explanation of withdrawal reasons. Should I prepare a public statement? Keep it factual and brief, Marcus said. Due to irreconcilable differences regarding corporate culture and operational practices that fundamentally violate our business ethics and legal standards. Apex Industries is withdrawing completely from the proposed acquisition of Skyline Airways, effective immediately. All related contracts, partnerships, and financial commitments are terminated as of market close today. That's going to generate intense media scrutiny about what specifically occurred. Marcus smiled with an expression that Catherine couldn't see but would have recognized immediately. Then interested parties should ask Skyline Airways to explain their corporate culture and operational practices. I'm confident they'll provide illuminating responses. Officer Chen, who had been monitoring social media alerts related to airline incidents, looked up from her computer with growing amazement. Sir, videos of your interaction with the flight crew have reached viral status across multiple platforms. The hashtag #SkylineShame is trending nationally, and the footage has been viewed over 2 million times in the past 3 hours. Marcus nodded, as if this development was expected rather than surprising. Catherine, coordinate with media relations to monitor social coverage, but don't engage directly with press inquiries. Let the documented evidence speak for itself. Understood completely. Marcus, the automated trading algorithms are prepared for execution. Once I enter the final authorization codes, this process becomes irreversible. Skyline Airways will lose approximately $500 million in market capitalization within the first hour of trading tomorrow morning. Marcus thought about the human cost of his decision. Sandra Mills would wake up unemployed and unemployable, her 15-year career destroyed by 4 minutes of revealed assumptions. James Crawford would face termination for cause and likely never work in aviation again. Richard Blackstone would lose premium travel privileges and face permanent association with documented racism. But he also thought about Tom Martinez, whose silence had enabled discrimination through moral cowardice, about the systematic nature of assumptions that had felt like professional intuition, about institutional cultures that protected bias through policies and procedures designed to look neutral while operating discriminatorily. Most importantly, he thought about future passengers who might face identical treatment, but lacked resources to impose consequences for institutional prejudice. Execute Protocol 7, Marcus said. Full authorization. Complete implementation. Let them discover what discrimination actually costs when imposed on people with power to make those costs immediate and proportional. Catherine's fingers moved across her keyboard, entering authorization codes that would trigger the most expensive customer service failure in corporate history. Protocol 7 is now active and irreversible. All withdrawal mechanisms will execute automatically at market opening. Marcus, you've just cost them $500 million with a single phone call. Marcus ended the conversation and turned to face the 2 security officers who had been listening to fragments of financial warfare being conducted with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness. Gentlemen, Marcus said, straightening his casual clothes and preparing to leave, I suspect you should contact your media relations department. There's likely to be significant attention around this incident over the next several days. Officer Martinez stared at him, with an expression approaching awe. Sir, are you saying that this passenger service incident is going to become a major news story? I'm saying, Marcus replied, that what happened on Flight 847 wasn't just customer service failure. It was institutional discrimination, revealing itself completely, and the consequences will be exactly proportional to the revelation. As Marcus prepared to leave Airport Security Office B7, he reflected on the morning's events with a sense of completion rather than revenge. This wasn't about punishment or personal satisfaction. It was about accountability and consequences, about ensuring that comfortable assumptions carried costs that institutions couldn't afford to ignore. In 18 hours, financial markets would discover exactly what those costs looked like when calculated precisely and imposed immediately. At exactly 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday morning, automated trading algorithms across multiple stock exchanges began detecting unusual activity patterns in Skyline Airways shares. The sophisticated systems were designed to identify large volume transactions that deviated significantly from normal trading behaviors, particularly seeking institutional moves that might signal insider information or strategic shifts by major investors. What they discovered was unprecedented in both scope and precision. Massive sell orders were hitting the market with mechanical efficiency, not the emotional, panic-driven liquidation of retail investors reacting to bad news, but the calculated, systematic disposal of enormous institutional positions. The digital signatures indicated origination from Apex Capital Management, the investment division of Marcus Washington's business empire. But the scale and coordination suggested extensive preparation rather than reactive decision-making. Within 2 minutes of market opening, Skyline Airways stock had dropped from its previous close of $47.32 to $45.18. Within 4 minutes, it had fallen to $42.94. By 9:37 a.m., the price had collapsed to $39.81, representing a decline of more than 16% in 7 minutes, with no apparent fundamental catalyst other than massive coordinated selling pressure. On the 42nd floor of Goldman Sachs Manhattan headquarters, senior aviation analyst Rebecca Torres watched her Bloomberg terminal with complete bewilderment. She had covered airline securities for 14 years, surviving multiple industry crises, economic downturns, and market volatilities, but had never witnessed anything resembling the systematic destruction of market value occurring in real time. Her screens displayed trading volume at 18 times normal levels, with sell orders continuing to overwhelm available buyers faster than market makers could provide liquidity. The stock price was an absolute free fall, but she couldn't identify any operational, financial, or regulatory catalyst that would justify such dramatic devaluation. Her Bloomberg terminal chimed with breaking news. Skyline Airways, major investor withdraws from $2.8 billion acquisition. CIT's cultural and operational concerns. Rebecca's coffee mug shattered against her desk as her hand trembled reading the news summary. The brief report explained that Apex Industries, controlled by billionaire Marcus Washington, had withdrawn completely from its planned acquisition of Skyline Airways, citing irreconcilable differences regarding corporate culture and operational practices that fundamentally violate business ethics and legal compliance standards. The withdrawal had triggered multiple contractual clauses that immediately voided $800 million in bridge financing, canceled expansion partnerships across 4 continents, and terminated vendor relationships representing $200 million in annual revenue. Before Rebecca could fully process the implications, her phone was ringing. The caller ID showed David Hoffman from Skyline Airways Investor Relations Department. "Rebecca, we need to talk immediately." David's voice carried barely controlled panic, mixed with desperate damage control energy. "I'm assuming you're watching the same market destruction we are. David, explain what's happening. Your stock has lost 20% of its value in 10 minutes. There's breaking news about a canceled acquisition worth $2.8 billion, and I'm seeing social media references to discrimination incidents. Give me something coherent to tell institutional clients." David Hoffman had managed investor communications for Skyline Airways through regulatory investigations, labor disputes, and competitive challenges that had tested his crisis management skills. But nothing in his professional experience had prepared him for explaining how passenger service assumptions had destroyed the largest acquisition in company history. The transaction was Marcus Washington acquiring us for $2.8 billion, scheduled to close this Friday. Yesterday morning, he was on Flight 847 to London, traveling under an alias as part of his final cultural assessment of our operations. There was a serious incident with flight crew. Rebecca pulled up her research database on Marcus Washington while listening to David's explanation. Apex Industries CEO, legendary for walking away from acquisitions. When due diligence revealed cultural or ethical problems, estimated net worth $2.8 billion, built from technology startup to diversified industrial conglomerate reputation for absolute principles regarding business ethics and employee treatment. What kind of incident could cost you a $2.8 billion deal in 12 hours? David's voice carried the hollow tone of someone watching his career disintegrate in real time. Flight attendants made assumptions about his seating assignment based on his appearance and casual dress. When he refused to relocate from business class to economy, they escalated through multiple authority levels and eventually had airport security remove him from the aircraft. Rebecca stared at her trading screens, where Skyline's stock price had just broken through $37 per share, down 22% in 15 minutes. David, please tell me you're not explaining that your flight crew destroyed a $2.8 billion acquisition because they couldn't conceive of a black billionaire belonging in premium seating. The silence on the phone lasted long enough for another 50 cents to disappear from Skyline's share price. That's essentially what occurred. David finally admitted. Rebecca looked at her monitors, showing trading volume that had now exceeded 28 times normal levels. Social media analytics were flagging explosive negative sentiment around hashtags like Skyline Shame, billion-dollar discrimination, and airline accountability. Cable news networks were beginning to interrupt regular programming to cover what they were calling the most expensive customer service failure in corporate history. David, you need to understand the broader implications here. This isn't just about losing an acquisition deal. Institutional investors are going to demand explanations about risk management systems, corporate governance structures, and cultural liability frameworks. How does a company lose $2.8 billion because of employee training failures? What other cultural problems exist that could generate similar financial exposures? As they spoke, Skyline Airways stock price continued its relentless decline. By 10:00 a.m., it was trading at $33.47, down 29% from the previous close. The company had lost $531 million in market capitalization in 30 minutes, and selling pressure showed no signs of diminishing. More concerning for the broader aviation industry, the incident was creating what financial analysts called contagion effects throughout the sector. United Airlines, still carrying reputational scars from its own passenger relations disasters, fell 4.9%. American Airlines declined 4.2%, as corporate travel departments began scrutinizing airline diversity policies. Even Southwest Airlines, celebrated for inclusive corporate culture, dropped 2.3%, as investors priced in industry-wide cultural liability risks. Cable television networks were now providing continuous coverage of what business journalists were calling discrimination at altitude. Social media platforms were amplifying the original live stream footage exponentially, with millions of views generating thousands of reaction videos, commentary pieces, and analytical discussions from civil rights leaders, business ethics experts, and ordinary travelers sharing similar experiences. By 11:30 a.m., Skyline Airways had lost $587 million in market value, representing the single largest one-day devaluation in the company's corporate history. But the financial devastation was accelerating rather than stabilizing, as institutional investors recognized that cultural liability could generate quantifiable costs that traditional risk management systems couldn't predict or prevent. International markets were taking notice as European and Asian airlines faced questions about their own passenger service protocols and discrimination complaint procedures. The Skyline Airways incident was becoming a global case study in how individual experiences of bias could transform into systematic institutional crises when amplified through social media and imposed through financial markets. Rebecca Torres completed her emergency research report, knowing that her analysis would influence institutional investment decisions affecting hundreds of millions of dollars in airline sector holdings. Her conclusion was unambiguous. Marcus Washington's customer service experience had cost Skyline Airways approximately $600 million in direct and indirect financial impact, making it the most expensive premium cabin seat in aviation history, and demonstrating that discrimination carried quantifiable costs that could be imposed immediately by individuals with sufficient economic power. The market had delivered its verdict on institutional prejudice. It was not just morally indefensible, but economically unsustainable in an interconnected world where individual injustices could become global controversies within hours. The 43rd floor of Skyline Airways corporate headquarters in Atlanta had been converted into a crisis command center by 11:00 a.m. Tuesday morning. The executive boardroom, normally reserved for quarterly strategic planning and board meetings, now hummed with desperate energy as lawyers, public relations specialists, operations managers, and increasingly panicked executives attempted to contain a disaster that was expanding faster than their response capabilities. CEO Rebecca Torres sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, surrounded by laptops displaying real-time stock prices, social media monitoring dashboards, legal risk assessments, and news coverage analysis that painted an increasingly catastrophic picture. Wall-mounted screens showed the relentless decline of their market value, with each refresh bringing worse numbers and more devastating projections. The hashtag Skyline Shame had generated over 200,000 mentions in 18 hours. Videos from Alex Rivera's live stream were being shared across every social media platform, spawning thousands of reaction videos and analytical commentary from civil rights advocates, business ethics professors, and millions of ordinary travelers who recognized their own experiences of discrimination in Marcus Washington's treatment. "Someone provide me with a comprehensive explanation," Rebecca Torres said, her voice controlled, but carrying the edge of someone watching a career disintegrate, of how we transformed from completing the largest acquisition in company history to losing $600 million in market value because of assumptions made in a business-class cabin. General Counsel Michael Hartley consulted multiple tablets and legal briefs with the expression of someone delivering multiple death sentences simultaneously. Flight Service Manager James Crawford and Head Flight Attendant Sandra Mills made determinations about passenger Marcus Washington based on visual assessment and unconscious bias patterns rather than standard verification procedures. When he refused to accept relocation from his assigned premium seat, they escalated through progressively more aggressive authority levels, ultimately characterizing him as a security threat and coordinating his removal through airport police. And they had absolutely no knowledge of his identity or business relationship with our company. He was traveling under his legally registered alias, M. Walker, which he uses consistently for business travel privacy. Our VIP recognition protocols require passengers to self-identify during booking processes, which Washington deliberately avoided to maintain anonymity during his cultural assessment of our operations. Board member Charles Morrison's voice carried through the video conference system from his Chicago office with barely concealed fury. How is it possible that we had no systems for identifying someone in the process of purchasing our entire company? Don't we maintain any protocols for recognizing major stakeholders or high-value business partners? Rebecca Torres felt migraine pressure building as she contemplated the systemic failures that had enabled this crisis. Our recognition systems depend entirely on passenger self-identification or staff visual recognition. Washington specifically maintained complete anonymity to conduct authentic evaluation of our standard service delivery without VIP treatment that might mask cultural problems. The boardroom fell silent as everyone processed the devastating irony. Marcus Washington hadn't just been a passenger experiencing discrimination. He had been conducting final due diligence testing, and their corporate culture had failed so completely that he was willing to sacrifice $2.8 billion rather than associate his business empire with their institutional practices. Chief Marketing Officer Lisa Chen displayed social media analytics that looked like epidemiological charts tracking viral disease spread. The story has reached an estimated 30 million people across all digital platforms in less than 24 hours. Sentiment analysis shows 98% negative reaction. We're witnessing organized boycott campaigns from passenger advocacy organizations, civil rights groups, labor unions, and corporate travel management companies representing billions in annual revenue. Competitive response. Delta United and American are running targeted advertising, emphasizing their diversity training and inclusive service policies. They're essentially using our crisis as market positioning opportunity, highlighting their cultural commitments while our brand becomes synonymous with institutional discrimination. Legal exposure assessment. Rebecca asked, though she suspected the answer would be catastrophic. Michael Hartley's expression grew progressively more grim as he reviewed documents that seemed to multiply with each page turn. Extensive federal civil rights violations under multiple statutes, breach of service contract claims, potential class action litigation from other passengers who experienced similar treatment. Department of Transportation, investigation. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, formal inquiry, and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, systematic review of our employment practices. Specific damages and penalties. Washington's legal team has filed preliminary claims seeking punitive damages in excess of $500 million, injunctive relief requiring federal oversight of our passenger service protocols, mandatory third-party auditing of discrimination complaints, and personal liability assessments for executives who created or maintained discriminatory policies and training programs. Chief Financial Officer Robert Kim looked up from his phone, where he'd been monitoring market conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. Stock closed down 34% today, representing $612 million in destroyed market value. The acquisition cancellation triggered debt covenant violations on our $300 million credit facilities. We're facing margin call requirements by end of business Friday if we can't demonstrate improved financial stability and operational control. Can we meet those financial requirements? Not under current market conditions and revenue projections. Credit rating agencies have placed us on negative watch with strong likelihood of downgrade to junk status, which will increase borrowing costs on all existing debt instruments. 5 major corporate accounts representing $73 million in annual revenue have suspended bookings pending resolution of discrimination allegations. International partnership agreements worth $120 million are under review by European carriers who are distancing themselves from the controversy. Operations Director Janet Phillips, who had been reviewing personnel files and incident reports, spoke with visible frustration and disappointment. I've analyzed what our crew actually did versus what they were trained to do, and it's a complete failure at every level. James Crawford had 16 years of experience and consistent performance evaluations. Sandra Mills had completed advanced diversity and inclusion training just 8 months ago. They ignored every protocol we teach, violated every policy we maintain, and escalated a routine verification procedure into federal discrimination charges. Specifically, how they never checked Washington's boarding pass, against the passenger manifest basic verification that takes 30 seconds. They never attempted standard conflict resolution procedures that could have clarified any confusion immediately. They never examined his identification or frequent flyer status. They escalated directly to security removal, based purely on visual profiling and demographic assumptions. Rebecca Torres stared at the wall monitors, showing their stock price in continued decline. Understanding that she was witnessing the most expensive customer service failure in aviation history, playing out in real time with global media coverage. Her assistant entered the boardroom carrying a secure phone with obvious urgency. "Ma'am, Marcus Washington's office is on line 1. His executive assistant says he's prepared to speak with you directly, but only for a limited time." The boardroom atmosphere shifted immediately, as everyone recognized this conversation would determine whether Skyline Airways survived as an independent company or became a case study in how discrimination could destroy corporate value within hours. Rebecca reached for the phone, knowing that the next few minutes would define not only her career, but the futures of 18,000 Skyline Airways employees, whose livelihoods hung in the balance of decisions made by flight attendants who had assumed no one powerful was watching their comfortable prejudices operate through company systems. "Mr. Washington, this is Rebecca Torres, CEO of Skyline Airways. Before any other discussion, I want to offer my personal and unreserved apology for the completely unacceptable treatment you experienced on Flight 847. What happened to you was discriminatory, morally wrong, and entirely contradictory to our stated corporate values and official policies." Marcus Washington stood in JFK's premium lounge overlooking the tarmac, where Skyline Airways aircraft moved in their familiar choreography, unaware that their corporate existence hung in the balance of this conversation. He had changed from his casual travel clothes into a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, transforming visually from the anonymous passenger who had been escorted off Flight 847 into the billionaire industrialist whose single phone call had destroyed $600 million in market value. The transformation was deliberate. He wanted Rebecca Torres to understand exactly who her employees had humiliated and what their comfortable assumptions had actually cost. "Miss Torres." Marcus replied, his voice carrying the measured distance of someone who had already rendered judgment and was now calculating appropriate consequences. "I appreciate your call and your apology, but I need to ask directly, are you apologizing because your employee's behavior was morally indefensible, or because you've discovered it was financially catastrophic?" Rebecca Torres felt the question penetrate like a surgical probe, exposing the uncomfortable reality that her response had been triggered more by market collapse than ethical outrage. Around the conference table, her executive team leaned forward to hear both sides of a conversation that would determine their professional futures. "I'm apologizing," Rebecca said, choosing her words with extreme care, "because what happened to you revealed systematic cultural failures that allowed institutional discrimination to operate under the disguise of customer service excellence. Your treatment was unacceptable, regardless of your identity, wealth, or business relationship with our company." "Business relationship we might have had," Marcus corrected. "Mr. Washington, I understand you've implemented complete withdrawal from our acquisition through what your team designated as Protocol 7. I'm calling to explore whether there's any reforms, accountability measures, or structural changes that could potentially salvage some form of partnership and begin repairing the enormous damage that's been inflicted." Marcus walked slowly through the premium lounge, passing other high-value travelers who were beginning to recognize him from social media coverage that had transformed his face into a symbol of corporate accountability and civil rights enforcement. Some nodded respectfully, others approached quietly to express support, and many simply stared with the fascination of people witnessing historical events unfold in real time. What would you propose to salvage the relationship? Marcus asked. Immediate termination of every employee involved in the incident without severance or positive references. Comprehensive federal investigation of all passenger service protocols and discrimination complaint procedures. Mandatory retraining of every customer-facing employee using curricula developed by civil rights organizations rather than airline industry consultants. Implementation of independent oversight mechanisms for bias, complaints with authority to impose financial penalties. Federal monitoring of our compliance with civil rights laws. Executive compensation, directly tied to measurable diversity and inclusion outcomes. Marcus paused his movement, genuinely surprised by the comprehensiveness of her response. Most corporate executives in crisis mode focused on immediate damage control and legal liability minimization. Rebecca's willingness to accept federal oversight and tie executive pay to equity metrics suggested either authentic recognition of systematic problems or exceptionally sophisticated crisis management. And you believe those changes would address the fundamental cultural issues? I believe they would address the visible symptoms while we work on deeper transformation. But you're absolutely right that the real problems extend far beyond individual employee prejudices or specific policy failures. We created an institutional environment where assumptions about passengers were treated as professional expertise, where bias operated through official procedures, and where employees felt authorized to make service decisions based on demographic profiling rather than factual verification. Rebecca Torres surveyed her executive team around the conference table. Intelligent, educated professionals who had built successful careers, providing airline services, most genuinely committed to customer satisfaction and operational excellence. She also recognized the collective institutional blindness that had enabled discriminatory practices to flourish behind facades of service quality and premium cabin standards. The fundamental problem, she continued, is that we hired capable people and equipped them with systems that enabled discriminatory decisions. We trained them to recognize passenger categories and service appropriateness without examining the unconscious biases that shaped those classifications. We rewarded operational smoothness over equitable treatment, customer satisfaction metrics over civil rights compliance. Marcus resumed walking, impressed, despite his skepticism, by the analytical depth of Rebecca's response. Most executives in similar circumstances deployed generic corporate language designed to sound responsible while admitting nothing specific. Her willingness to acknowledge systematic institutional failures suggested either genuine insight or exceptionally well-coached damage control. Miss Torres, do you understand what I was actually doing on your aircraft yesterday morning? Conducting final cultural assessment as part of your acquisition due diligence process. I was determining whether Skyline Airways deserved to continue existing as an institution, whether your corporate culture could support the kind of aviation industry that serves all passengers with dignity, or whether your entire organization needed to be dissolved and reconstructed from foundational principles upward. The conference room fell completely silent, as everyone grasped that this wasn't about recovering a business transaction or minimizing financial losses. This was an existential evaluation of their institutional worthiness, conducted by someone with power to enforce his conclusions through market mechanisms. And what was your determination? Marcus smiled, though Rebecca couldn't see the expression through the phone. That your employees performed exactly as your systems trained them to perform. That your institutional culture functioned perfectly according to its actual priorities, rather than its official statements. That the discrimination I experienced wasn't a malfunction in your corporate values. It was those values operating with complete consistency and effectiveness. Mr. Washington. However, Marcus continued, your response over the past 24 hours suggests you recognize the magnitude of what occurred. Not just the financial consequences, but the moral implications. The question is, Whether you're capable of authentic institutional transformation or merely sophisticated reputation management, Rebecca Torres felt the weight of 18,000 employees, millions of annual passengers, and billions in stakeholder value, depending on her ability to convince Marcus Washington that genuine change was possible, rather than just profitable crisis management. I believe we're capable of real transformation. But I also recognize that commitments are meaningless without enforcement mechanisms, and promises are worthless without accountability structures that make backsliding financially impossible. Then let me propose something fundamentally different from our original agreement. Every person in the conference room stopped breathing. I'm willing to consider a restructured partnership, not the acquisition we originally negotiated. That arrangement died when your crew invoked security protocols to enforce racial discrimination, but something that might work if you're genuinely committed to transformation rather than just damage control. Rebecca Torres gripped the phone with both hands. What kind of partnership structure? Equity investment with operational oversight and cultural transformation authority. 40% ownership for $1.2 billion, half our original investment, but with comprehensive control over passenger service policies and discrimination prevention systems. I want board representation with veto power over senior management decisions, complete authority to restructure customer service protocols, and unlimited power to terminate anyone at any organizational level who demonstrates bias in passenger treatment. The terms were harsh, but not unreasonable. Marcus was offering institutional survival in exchange for accountability, financial rescue, in return for cultural revolution. But the personal costs would be significant for executives who had built careers on autonomous authority. Specific operational requirements. James Crawford and Sandra Mills terminated immediately for cause. No severance packages. No positive references. Explicit notation in personnel records that they're ineligible for rehire due to discriminatory conduct. They demonstrated exactly who they are through their actions, and I believe what I witnessed. Marcus paused, looking out at Skyline Airways aircraft that might soon operate under his direct cultural oversight. Every customer-facing employee retrained using protocols developed by civil rights organizations with real-world experience in discrimination prevention, rather than airline industry consultants focused on operational efficiency. Independent Ombudsman Office with authority to investigate bias complaints and impose immediate financial penalties. Quarterly public reporting of passenger service metrics disaggregated by demographic categories, so patterns of discriminatory treatment become visible rather than hidden. He resumed walking through the lounge, considering the broader implications of what he was proposing. Most importantly, cultural transformation that transcends policies and procedures to create an institutional environment where human dignity is non-negotiable, where respect is assumed rather than earned through documentation, and where belonging is determined by tickets and rights rather than appearance and assumptions. Rebecca Torres closed her eyes briefly, understanding that accepting Marcus's terms meant acknowledging their company had failed morally as well as financially, that their cultural problems required external intervention rather than internal reform, and that their institutional credibility was so compromised that federal oversight was preferable to continued independence. But the alternative was bankruptcy, liquidation, and destruction of thousands of jobs, because flight attendants had made assumptions they'd never imagined could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Mr. Washington, on behalf of Skyline Airways Board of Directors and Executive Leadership, I accept your partnership terms and structural requirements. The conference room remained silent as everyone processed that they had just witnessed the most expensive customer service failure in aviation history, transformed into an opportunity for institutional redemption if they proved capable of meeting the standards that Marcus Washington would impose. Marcus Washington had not simply punished discrimination through financial consequences. He had created a framework for replacing institutional bias with systematic equity, transforming corporate failure into a laboratory for demonstrating that business success and social justice were not just compatible but mutually reinforcing. Whether Skyline Airways would rise to meet that challenge remained to be demonstrated through daily operations, passenger interactions, and cultural choices that would be monitored, measured, and evaluated by someone who understood that true power meant using privilege to protect dignity rather than exclude people from spaces they had earned the right to occupy. The price of prejudice had been calculated precisely $612 million in market value destruction. The price of redemption would be measured not in dollars, but in dignity restored, justice implemented, and equity demonstrated, one passenger interaction at a time. By Wednesday morning, the Skyline Airways incident had evolved from social media viral moment into a comprehensive cultural phenomenon that transcended the aviation industry and entered broader conversations about institutional discrimination, corporate accountability, and the true cost of unconscious bias in American business. Alex Rivera's original live stream had reached over 15 million views across all platforms, generating thousands of reaction videos, analytical commentary pieces, and deep dive discussions from civil rights leaders, business ethics, professors, employment lawyers, and millions of ordinary travelers who recognize their own experiences of discriminatory treatment in premium service environments. The viral expansion reflected more than simple outrage over individual prejudice. Marcus Washington's experience had become a focal point for accumulated frustration with systematic bias that minorities encountered daily in spaces designed for wealthy, predominantly white customers. The subtle challenges to belonging, the extra verification requirements, the assumptions about how people had obtained access to exclusive accommodations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, professor of corporate ethics at Harvard Business School, found herself booked on major news programs throughout the week, providing expert analysis that helped contextualize the incident's broader significance. What makes the Skyline Airways case historically important, she explained during her CNN interview with Anderson Cooper, isn't that discrimination occurred unfortunately that remains common across many industries and service environments. What's unprecedented is that the victim possessed immediate power to impose proportional financial consequences for that discrimination. Marcus Washington didn't just experience institutional bias, he ended it through market mechanisms that made prejudice economically unsustainable. The hashtag #SkylineShame had generated over 300,000 individual posts, creating a vast digital archive of similar stories shared by travelers from diverse backgrounds who recognized familiar patterns in Marcus's treatment. The narratives revealed consistent themes, assumptions about who belonged in premium spaces, coded language about behavioral concerns that correlated suspiciously with demographic categories and systems that consistently protected some passengers' comfort at the expense of others' basic dignity. Airport terminals across North America were experiencing immediate behavioral changes as Skyline Airways personnel faced unprecedented scrutiny from passengers who were now documenting interactions, challenging assumptions, and demanding explanations for service decisions that might reflect bias rather than policy. Corporate travel departments representing billions in annual airline revenue had begun comprehensive reviews of their carrier relationships, with several major companies issuing temporary suspensions of Skyline Airways bookings, pending investigation of discrimination complaint procedures and resolution outcomes. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Anti-Defamation League, the Congressional Black Caucus, and multiple civil rights organizations had issued coordinated statements condemning the incident, while calling for federal legislation requiring airlines to publicly report demographic patterns in passenger service delivery and complaint resolution. International media coverage was framing the incident as evidence of persistent American racial inequality, despite decades of civil rights legislation and corporate diversity initiatives. The story was becoming a global symbol of how institutional discrimination operated through corporate structures that officially claimed to value inclusion while systematically enabling bias through policies, procedures, and cultural practices. But the most significant immediate impact was financial devastation that demonstrated discrimination's quantifiable cost when imposed by individuals with economic power to make those costs immediate and proportional to the harm inflicted. When markets opened Wednesday morning, Skyline Airways stock continued its decline, opening at $26.73 and falling throughout the trading session as institutional investors recognized that cultural liability could generate unpredictable financial exposures that traditional risk management systems couldn't anticipate or prevent. By market close Wednesday, the stock had settled at $23.84, representing total market value destruction of $687 million since Marcus Washington's phone call, making his customer service experience the most expensive premium cabin seat in corporate history. The broader aviation industry was experiencing systematic contagion effects as investors questioned whether similar cultural problems existed throughout the sector. Regulatory agencies announced investigations of industry-wide discrimination practices, and corporate travel departments scrutinized airline diversity policies as risk management considerations rather than public relations initiatives. Marcus Washington had not just punished one company's discrimination, he had illuminated systematic problems affecting millions of travelers while creating expectations for institutional change that would reshape service delivery standards across multiple industries. The comprehensive scope of Skyline Airways' financial crisis became apparent Thursday morning when all major credit rating agencies simultaneously downgraded the airline's debt securities to junk status, citing fundamental operational and reputational challenges that impair the company's ability to generate sustainable revenue streams and maintain competitive market positioning in an industry where cultural liability has emerged as a significant risk factor. Chief Financial Officer Robert Kim convened emergency meetings with Skyline's banking consortium at 5:30 a.m., attempting to prevent immediate liquidity crisis that could force bankruptcy proceedings within days. The financial institutions that had provided $900 million in acquisition bridge financing were now confronting the reality that their loans were secured by assets worth substantially less than outstanding principal balances. The financial mathematics are catastrophic and accelerating. Kim explained to the assembled bankers in J.P. Morgan Chase's crisis management conference room. We've lost $687 million in market capitalization, but that's just the beginning of cascading operational impacts that threaten our fundamental business model. The room felt like a financial emergency ward, with laptops displaying real-time credit default swap spreads, bond yields, and stock prices that painted an increasingly desperate picture of institutional survival prospects. Premium cabin bookings have declined 31% compared to equivalent periods last year, representing approximately $89 million in lost high-margin revenue over the next 12 months. Corporate travel accounts worth $94 million in annual contracts have either suspended relationships or transferred business to competitors. That represents not just revenue loss, but elimination of our most profitable customer segments. The cascade effects extended far beyond direct booking cancellations. Skyline's international partnerships were under comprehensive review with European carriers, having issued public statements distancing themselves from the discrimination controversy while privately renegotiating code-share agreements that could reduce international revenue by $127 million annually. The airline's government contracts for executive transportation and federal employee travel had been suspended pending Department of Transportation investigation of civil rights compliance procedures, eliminating $43 million in guaranteed annual revenue, while creating regulatory scrutiny that could affect future contract eligibility. Employee retention was becoming a critical operational challenge as Skyline personnel faced personal harassment, professional stigmatization, and family pressure from association with a company that had become synonymous with institutional discrimination. Flight attendants were reporting increased passenger hostility. Gate agents faced constant challenges to their decision-making authority, and customer service representatives were dealing with record complaint volumes while being blamed personally for corporate cultural failures. Insurance costs were escalating exponentially as Skyline became a litigation target for class action lawsuits, individual discrimination claims, and federal civil rights violations. Directors' and officers' liability premiums were expected to increase 500%, while general liability coverage costs would rise proportionally as the company faced systematic legal challenges to policies and practices that had operated without scrutiny for decades. Robert Kim displayed comprehensive financial projections that had consumed his team's efforts for 72 consecutive hours. Conservative estimates suggest total direct and indirect costs approaching $850 million over the next 18 months. Market value destruction, revenue losses, increased operational expenses, legal settlement reserves, regulatory compliance, investments, and employee retention costs. The senior credit officer from Bank of America reviewed the analysis with the grim expression of someone calculating loan loss provisions. Mr. Kim, these projections indicate that Skyline Airways cannot survive as an independent entity without the Marcus-Washington Partnership Agreement that was announced yesterday. The restructured equity investment appears to be existential rather than optional. Kim nodded with exhausted resignation. The partnership with Apex Industries isn't a growth opportunity anymore. It's corporate life support. Without Marcus Washington's $1.2 billion investment and operational oversight, we face Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings within 4 months. The irony was inescapable to everyone in the room. Marcus Washington, who had been removed from seat 2A for allegedly not belonging in business class, was now the only person capable of saving Skyline Airways from financial collapse caused by that very discrimination. But the implications extended far beyond individual corporate survival. The incident had demonstrated that discrimination carried quantifiable costs that could be imposed immediately when bias targeted individuals with sufficient economic power to make those costs proportional to the harm inflicted. Business schools were already developing case studies examining how reputational risk could transform minor operational incidents into existential corporate crises, when those incidents revealed systematic institutional bias to people capable of financial retaliation. The Harvard Business Review had commissioned analysis of the Washington effect, the phenomenon of individual discrimination experiences becoming corporate catastrophes when documented, amplified through social media, and met with consequences proportional to institutional harm rather than individual inconvenience. Financial markets had delivered their verdict. Discrimination was not just morally indefensible, but economically unsustainable in interconnected economies, where personal experiences could become global controversies within hours, and individual purchasing decisions could determine corporate survival. Marcus Washington had proven that the cost of prejudice could be calculated with mathematical precision and presented as an immediate bill that institutions couldn't defer, discount, or dispute through legal technicalities or public relations campaigns. Sandra Mills sat in her suburban Atlanta kitchen at 5:47 a.m. Thursday morning, surrounded by newspapers, legal documents, and a laptop screen displaying social media feeds that had transformed her from respected flight attendant into the most recognizable face of corporate discrimination in America. Her personal Facebook page had been shared 400,000 times. Her LinkedIn profile had generated 50,000 comments, ranging from professional disappointment to explicit death threats. And her high school graduation photo had somehow become a meme, symbolizing unconscious bias in customer service environments. The cruelest aspect of her public destruction was that Sandra genuinely had never considered herself prejudiced. She maintained friendships with Black colleagues, had consistently supported Democratic candidates who championed civil rights, and had participated actively in Skyline's diversity and inclusion training programs. Her assumptions about Marcus Washington had felt like professional expertise rather than racial bias, decisions based on legitimate passenger service experience rather than discriminatory profiling. But intent she was learning through thousands of social media comments and news analysis pieces mattered significantly less than impact. When that impact was documented in high-definition video and analyzed by federal judges, civil rights lawyers, and millions of observers who recognized systematic patterns of discrimination disguised as customer service excellence. Her termination letter from Skyline Airways had arrived via certified mail. Tuesday evening, terminated for cause due to discriminatory conduct. No severance compensation, no positive employment references, and explicit notation in industry databases that she was ineligible for rehire in any customer-facing aviation position due to civil rights violations. 15 years of career development performance awards and customer service recognition had been eliminated by a 4-minute interaction that revealed unconscious assumptions she hadn't even recognized as problematic until they destroyed her professional life completely. Her children were experiencing harassment at school, with classmates chanting, "Your mom is racist," during lunch periods, and teachers struggling to address classroom disruptions created by their association with viral discrimination footage. Her husband, a high school mathematics teacher, had been placed on administrative leave while his school district investigated whether his relationship with her would affect his ability to work effectively with diverse student populations. The psychological trauma was compounding daily as Sandra confronted video evidence of her own bias, operating in real time, forcing recognition that fundamental beliefs about her character and values had been inaccurate or self-deceptive. James Crawford faced similar personal destruction, but with additional burden of management responsibility and public recognition as someone whose discrimination decisions had cost his company nearly $700 million in market value. His 15-year progression through Skyline's management hierarchy had ended with termination for cause and industry blacklisting that would likely prevent employment in aviation for the remainder of his career. But James was also experiencing what psychologists termed cognitive dissonance crisis, the mental trauma of discovering that core beliefs about his professional competence and moral character had been contradicted by documented evidence of systematic bias in his decision-making processes. The video footage of his interaction with Marcus Washington had been analyzed by employment lawyers, business ethics professors, and civil rights advocates who used his language patterns as textbook examples of how institutional discrimination operated through policies and procedures designed to appear neutral while functioning discriminatorily. Tom Martinez, the junior flight attendant who had witnessed the entire incident without intervention, was experiencing different but equally profound psychological consequences. He had not been terminated, but was suffering overwhelming guilt about his moral cowardice during a moment when speaking up might have prevented systematic discrimination from escalating into corporate catastrophe. 4 days after the incident, Tom made a decision that would define his character for the remainder of his life. He requested a meeting with Skyline Airways' newly appointed Director of Civil Rights Compliance, a position created in immediate response to the Washington incident, and submitted a comprehensive whistleblower report documenting not just what had occurred on Flight 847, but systematic patterns of discriminatory behavior he had observed throughout his employment. His report detailed coded language about passenger appropriateness based on appearance service decisions influenced by racial and socioeconomic assumptions that were never explicitly discussed but consistently applied, and training programs that taught bias recognition through theoretical discussions while failing to address practical implementation in real passenger interactions. Tom's documentation would eventually trigger Department of Transportation investigations that examined 5 years of Skyline Airways passenger service records, leading to federal legislation requiring implicit bias training for all commercial aviation personnel and mandatory public reporting of discrimination complaint patterns and resolution outcomes. His decision to speak up marked his transformation from passive bystander to active advocate for institutional change, channeling the moral courage he had failed to demonstrate during the original incident into comprehensive documentation that would help prevent similar discrimination from occurring in future passenger interactions. Margaret Chen, the federal judge who had witnessed the discrimination and provided real-time constitutional analysis, was using her experience as foundation for a Harvard Law Review article that would become required reading in constitutional law courses, business schools, and civil rights advocacy training programs across the country. Her detailed legal analysis of how airline authority intersected with federal civil rights protections was helping establish judicial frameworks for addressing institutional discrimination in transportation settings, providing precedents that other courts could apply when evaluating similar cases. Alex Rivera, whose live stream had documented the entire incident for millions of viewers, found himself managing media attention and advocacy opportunities he had never anticipated. Major networks were competing to interview him. Social media companies wanted exclusive content, partnerships, and civil rights organizations were asking him to become a spokesperson for passenger rights and discrimination documentation. But Alex was more committed to systematic change than personal fame or financial opportunity. He used his platform to establish Dignity at 30,000 Feet, a nonprofit organization working with established civil rights groups to advocate for federal legislation requiring airlines to publicly report discrimination complaints, resolution outcomes, and demographic patterns in passenger service delivery. The human cost of the Skyline Airways incident was being measured not just in destroyed careers and traumatized families, but in broader recognition that discrimination affected everyone involved: victims, perpetrators, witnesses, and communities that had to choose between comfortable silence and uncomfortable accountability. Each person's response to the crisis revealed character in ways that would influence their relationships, opportunities, and self-understanding for years to come, demonstrating that moments of moral testing create consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstances into fundamental questions about who people choose to be when confronted with injustice. They can either enable or oppose. 8 days after the incident that had cost Skyline Airways $687 million and fundamentally altered aviation industry practices, Marcus Washington agreed to his first and only comprehensive interview about the situation. He chose 60 Minutes, recognizing that the program's reputation for serious journalism and broad viewership would allow his perspective to reach the most diverse audience possible, while establishing definitive record of his motivations and intentions. CBS correspondent Leslie Stahl met him in his Manhattan office on the 51st floor of the Apex Industries headquarters, with panoramic views of the city, where his transformation from Detroit poverty to billionaire industrialist had required navigating every form of discrimination that American capitalism could systematically deploy against successful minorities. The office reflected Marcus's personality, expensively simple, with original artwork from Black artists, whose creativity had been historically excluded from mainstream galleries and museums, and books spanning business strategy, civil rights history, and ethical philosophy. Mr. Washington Stahl began, her voice carrying the gravitas developed through decades of interviewing presidents, foreign leaders, and individuals who had shaped historical events. You could have quietly endured the treatment you received on Flight 847, completed your $2.8 billion acquisition of Skyline Airways, and then implemented comprehensive reforms from inside the company. Instead, you chose to walk away from that massive investment and cost the airline nearly $700 million in market value. Help our viewers understand the reasoning behind such a dramatic response. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, considering the question that had been posed by investors, analysts, civil rights leaders, and business journalists throughout the previous week. Leslie, institutional discrimination isn't a customer service problem that can be solved by firing individual employees and updating training manuals. It's a cultural problem that reveals itself most clearly in how organizations treat people when they believe no one with power is observing their behavior. But couldn't you have created more comprehensive change by owning Skyline Airways completely? With total control, you could have reformed every policy, procedure, and cultural practice. Marcus walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that provided views of Manhattan's diverse population, navigating daily interactions shaped by countless assumptions about who belonged where and who deserved what levels of respect and accommodation. I could have changed the written policies, the official training programs, and the documented procedures, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades experiencing discrimination despite possessing wealth and education that theoretically should have protected him from such treatment. But I couldn't have changed the instinct that made Sandra Mills look at me and immediately decide I didn't belong in seat 2A. That instinct was developed through years of systems that taught her to categorize passengers based on appearance rather than documentation. Stahl consulted her research notes, which included opinion pieces and social media posts that had criticized Marcus's response as disproportionate to the offense. Some commentators have characterized your reaction as excessive. A recent Wall Street Journal editorial argued that you destroyed hundreds of jobs and eliminated billions in pension fund value over what was essentially a seating misunderstanding. How do you respond to that characterization? Marcus's expression hardened with controlled anger that reflected decades of having his experiences of discrimination minimized, dismissed, or reframed as misunderstandings rather than systematic institutional bias. Those jobs were destroyed by discrimination, not by my response to discrimination, he said firmly. Those pension funds lost value because of corporate culture that enabled and protected bias, not because of my decision to withdraw financial support from that culture. I categorically refused to accept responsibility for consequences that were directly caused by other people's choices and actions. He returned to his desk, where a framed photograph displayed his grandmother, the woman who had mortgaged her Detroit home to provide the $500 loan that had launched his business empire and taught him that dignity was more valuable than financial security. The people criticizing my response are essentially arguing that I should have accepted discrimination gracefully to protect the economic interests of people who benefit from systems that enable discrimination. Marcus continued. That argument reveals exactly why those systems persist, because the cost of challenging them has traditionally fallen on the victims rather than the perpetrators. What message do you want other business leaders to take from this incident? Marcus walked to a bookshelf containing volumes on business ethics, constitutional law, and civil rights history, subjects that had become central to his philosophy of principled capitalism and ethical wealth accumulation. The primary message is that human dignity is non-negotiable, regardless of economic considerations or operational convenience. That respect isn't something people earn by proving they belong. It's something everyone deserves because they're human beings with inherent worth and constitutional rights. He pulled out a worn copy of Letter from Birmingham Jail and held it thoughtfully. But the broader message for business leaders is that in an interconnected world where individual experiences can become global conversations, within hours, the traditional cost-benefit analysis of discrimination has changed fundamentally. Institutional bias is no longer sustainable from purely economic perspective, regardless of moral considerations. What does that mean, practically? It means that companies can no longer afford to discriminate, even if they want to, because the reputational and financial risks have become existential rather than manageable. When individual experiences of bias can generate hundreds of millions of dollars in immediate losses, discrimination becomes economically irrational rather than just morally indefensible. Stahl asked the question that business ethicists and civil rights advocates had been debating since the incident. Do you have any regrets about the severity of your response given the widespread consequences for employees and stakeholders who weren't directly involved in the discrimination you experienced? Marcus was quiet for several moments, looking out at the city where millions of people faced daily indignities that would never generate headlines, viral videos, or financial consequences for the institutions that enabled their mistreatment. "I regret that such a response was necessary," he finally said. "I regret that in 2024, a black man wearing expensive clothes still has to prove he belongs in spaces he's legally purchased access to. I regret that decades of civil rights legislation and corporate diversity initiatives haven't created business cultures that automatically respect human dignity, rather than requiring external enforcement." His voice carried accumulated weariness from a lifetime of experiencing assumptions, challenges, and subtle hostilities that most people never faced or recognized. "I regret that unconscious bias training and inclusion seminars haven't prevented the kind of institutional discrimination I encountered on Flight 847. I regret that federal civil rights laws haven't been sufficient to create corporate environments where respect is assumed rather than earned through demonstration of worthiness." Marcus returned to his chair, his expression becoming more analytical as he shifted from personal reflection to strategic assessment. "But do I regret holding a corporation accountable for systematic discrimination through financial consequences proportional to the harm they inflicted? Do I regret demonstrating that assumptions about who belongs where can carry immediate quantifiable costs? Do I regret proving that dignity has measurable economic value that institutions ignore at their own peril? Absolutely not. What's your vision for long-term change in corporate America?" Marcus pulled up a presentation on his computer, showing organizational structures and accountability frameworks that would govern Skyline Airways operations under his oversight partnership. "Real transformation requires what I call accountability architecture systems designed to identify discrimination quickly and impose immediate consequences for bias at every organizational level. We're implementing monitoring systems that track passenger interactions for demographic patterns, documentation requirements that eliminate subjective decision-making in service delivery, and compensation structures that make discrimination economically irrational for individual employees and managers." He displayed charts showing how employee evaluations, promotion criteria, and executive bonuses would be tied directly to measurable outcomes in equitable service delivery. But institutional change also requires individual courage from people who witness discrimination and choose to speak up rather than stay silent. Tom Martinez's decision to become a whistleblower after initially remaining passive shows that personal transformation is possible even when initial responses fall short of moral ideals. And your partnership with Skyline Airways. Do you believe they're capable of genuine cultural transformation? Marcus smiled, with an expression that combined cautious optimism with realistic skepticism based on decades of experience with corporate reform promises. Cultural change is measured through daily actions over extended periods, not through policies and press releases. Skyline Airways will have the opportunity to demonstrate whether they're committed to equity through practice rather than just public relations. The accountability structures we're implementing will make their progress measurable and their failures costly. As the interview concluded, Marcus reflected on his unexpected role as a symbol of corporate accountability and civil rights enforcement. He had never sought to become the face of a movement, but had accepted the responsibility that came with economic power and public attention. The cost of prejudice, he told Stahl in his closing statement, is exactly what society chooses to make it. For too long, that cost has been borne primarily by victims rather than perpetrators. I've demonstrated that when people with sufficient resources decide to impose proportional consequences for discrimination, institutions change their behavior very quickly. The question is whether other business leaders will use their power similarly when they witness injustice that they have the capacity to address. The interview would be viewed by over 18 million people, becoming one of the highest-rated 60-minute segments in recent years. Marcus Washington's words would be quoted by business leaders, civil rights advocates, government officials, and academic researchers as they worked to understand and replicate the Washington effect, the phenomenon of individual discrimination experiences, becoming catalysts for systematic institutional change when met with consequences proportional to their harm. His example would inspire other individuals with economic influence to use their resources in defense of human dignity, transforming isolated incidents of bias into opportunities for comprehensive cultural reform across multiple industries and institutions. The departure lounge at JFK Terminal 4 appeared visually identical to how it had looked on that March morning when Marcus Washington first approached Gate A23. The same polished marble floors reflected the same carefully calibrated lighting. The same mixture of business travelers and vacation passengers moved through the same choreographed routines of modern commercial aviation. And the same departure announcements echoed through speakers promising on-time service and passenger satisfaction. But beneath the surface, similarities, fundamental transformations, had reshaped every aspect of airline operations, passenger interactions, and industry culture in ways that would influence commercial aviation for generations. Tom Martinez stood near Gate A23, no longer wearing the uniform of a junior flight attendant, but dressed in the professional attire of Skyline Airways' newly created Director of Passenger Experience and Civil Rights Compliance. His position had been established as part of Marcus Washington's restructuring agreement with Tom, selected based on his comprehensive whistleblower documentation and demonstrated commitment to preventing the discrimination he had witnessed but initially failed to challenge. His responsibilities encompassed far more than traditional customer service oversight. Tom's department operated real-time monitoring systems that analyzed passenger interactions for demographic patterns, investigated service complaints for evidence of systematic bias, and conducted random audits of crew performance to ensure policy changes were being implemented consistently rather than selectively. The measurable results were encouraging and comprehensive. Customer satisfaction scores had increased 34% across all demographic categories, as passengers reported feeling more respected and valued, regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived socioeconomic status. Employee satisfaction had also improved significantly as flight crews expressed greater confidence in their ability to provide consistent, equitable service without navigating ambiguous situations that might enable unconscious bias. Flight 847 to London. The same route, same aircraft configuration, often staffed by crew members who had not been terminated, now operated under completely different cultural principles and operational guidelines. Pre-flight briefings included explicit discussions of bias, recognition techniques, passenger service protocols, prioritized factual verification over intuitive assumptions, and conflict resolution procedures, required multiple documentation steps before any escalation to security intervention. Most significantly, Skyline Airways had implemented Marcus Washington's accountability architecture, comprehensive measurement systems that tracked service quality outcomes, disaggregated by passenger demographics, with crew performance evaluations and management compensation, tied directly to equitable treatment metrics, rather than abstract customer satisfaction scores. Discrimination had become not just morally wrong, but economically irrational at every level of the organization, as individual employees and corporate executives faced immediate financial consequences for decisions that reflected bias rather than documented policy compliance. The transformation extended far beyond Skyline Airways to encompass industry-wide reforms that affected every major airline in North America and many international carriers. Federal legislation now required annual public reporting of passenger discrimination complaints and resolution outcomes, creating transparency that allowed travelers to make informed choices about airline relationships based on demonstrated commitment to civil rights compliance. The Department of Transportation had implemented new enforcement mechanisms for passenger rights violations, while industry trade associations had developed standardized training curricula focused on bias recognition, constitutional compliance, and cultural competency in diverse service environments. Airlines were now competing publicly on diversity and inclusion metrics as marketing advantages, rather than treating equity as regulatory burden, recognizing that demonstrated commitment to respectful treatment had become a significant factor in passenger booking decisions and corporate travel contract negotiations. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological rather than procedural. Airline personnel at every organizational level understood that their assumptions about passengers could carry immediate, devastating consequences for their careers and their companies. The comfortable biases that had operated invisibly for decades were now subject to constant documentation, viral amplification, and potential financial accountability. Marcus Washington had not just reformed one company's policies, he had fundamentally altered power dynamics between service providers and service recipients, demonstrating that dignity was a right to be respected rather than a privilege to be granted based on appearance status or cultural familiarity. On a bright Tuesday morning in September, exactly 6 months after the incident that had cost Skyline Airways $687 million and transformed commercial aviation culture, Marcus Washington walked through JFK Terminal 4 once again. He wore identical casual clothes, the same dark jeans navy polo shirt, and leather loafers that had triggered the original crisis. But now his presence generated recognition and respect, rather than assumptions and suspicion. He was traveling to London for the grand opening of Apex Industries' new European headquarters, flying on Equity Airways, one of the minority-owned carriers that his investment fund had helped capitalize and expand internationally. The symbolism was intentional. An airline born from discrimination's ashes, funded through profits from holding corporations accountable for cultural failures, staffed by people who understood dignity's value from personal experience, rather than theoretical training. At Gate B-17, he was greeted by Captain Sarah Johnson, a black woman whose aviation career had been supported through one of Marcus's scholarship programs. Her presence in the cockpit represented industry transformation that extended beyond policy changes to encompass fundamental shifts in who was encouraged to pursue leadership roles in commercial aviation. "Good morning, Mr. Washington." Captain Johnson said, her voice carrying professional confidence that had never been shaken by doubt about her qualifications or belonging. "Your seat is ready whenever you'd like to board. Thank you for choosing to fly with us today." The words were simple, but represented everything Marcus had fought to achieve. Assumption of belonging rather than requirement to prove it. Respect offered rather than dignity earned through documentation. Humanity recognized rather than status demonstrated through expensive accessories or familiar cultural markers. As he settled into seat 2A, the same position that had started everything, Marcus opened his laptop to review materials for the upcoming board meeting. But his attention drifted to emails from business leaders, civil rights advocates, and government officials implementing systematic changes inspired by his example. Harvard Business School had established the Marcus Washington Institute for Corporate Ethics and Social Responsibility, focusing research on how individual experiences of discrimination could become catalysts for institutional transformation. The Department of Transportation had created specialized enforcement units for civil rights compliance in commercial transportation. Multiple industries beyond aviation were examining customer service practices for evidence of systematic bias that could generate Washington-effect consequences if revealed and documented. But Marcus was most proud of smaller, more personal transformations that might never generate headlines, but would influence millions of individual interactions. Tom Martinez's evolution from silent bystander to active advocate for equity. Sandra Mills's work with bias recognition training programs, transforming her personal failure into education that prevented others from making similar assumptions. Alex Rivera's Dignity at 30,000 Feet organization, which had secured federal funding for passenger rights education and discrimination reporting systems. The phone call that had destroyed $687 million in market value had also created opportunities for redemption learning and systematic improvement that would benefit travelers for generations to come. As Equity Airways Flight 203 lifted off from JFK and climbed toward cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean, Marcus looked through the window at the city that had provided both opportunities for success and tests of character throughout his journey from Detroit poverty to billionaire leadership. From this altitude, the divisions that seemed so significant on the ground neighborhoods, marked by race and class buildings housing privilege and exclusion, appeared small and temporary against the vast landscape of human possibility. But the principles were permanent and non-negotiable: dignity, respect, equity, justice. These weren't abstract concepts requiring philosophical debate, but practical necessities for any society claiming moral progress. They couldn't be legislated into existence through government mandates or trained into compliance through corporate seminars. They had to be chosen consciously, demonstrated consistently, and defended actively by every person who held any form of power over another person's experience. The flight to London proceeded smoothly and unremarkably, exactly as air travel should function for every passenger, regardless of appearance, background, or ability to prove belonging through documentation or demonstration of worthiness. The crew provided attentive service without question or qualification, treating each passenger as deserving of respect because of their humanity, rather than their ability to justify their presence. As the aircraft began its descent toward Heathrow Airport, Marcus closed his laptop and prepared for landing, understanding that tomorrow would bring new challenges to human dignity and new opportunities to defend it through principled action rather than comfortable silence. The struggle for equality was not a problem to be solved through single dramatic gestures, but a commitment to be renewed daily through countless individual choices about how to treat people when no one important seemed to be watching. It required constant vigilance against the comfortable assumptions that enabled discrimination, continuous courage to speak up when witnessing injustice, and persistent determination to use whatever power one possessed in defense of those who lacked similar resources. The price of prejudice had been calculated with mathematical precision: $687 million in market value, destruction, destroyed careers, damaged reputations, and institutional transformation that would cost hundreds of millions more to implement properly. But the price of justice, choosing equity over comfort, accountability over convenience, transformation over maintenance of profitable but immoral systems, had proven immeasurably higher and infinitely more valuable. Marcus Washington had not just changed an airline or transformed an industry. He had demonstrated that power, when understood correctly and applied courageously, could reshape the fundamental systems governing how people treated each other. In spaces where dignity should be assumed rather than earned, respect should be automatic rather than conditional, and belonging should be determined by rights rather than appearance. As the aircraft touched down at Heathrow, Marcus smiled and prepared to continue the work of building a world where those principles operated practically rather than theoretically, where they were implemented systematically rather than hoped for individually, and where they were protected actively rather than violated comfortably. In his briefcase, he carried investment contracts for 4 new minority-owned aviation companies, scholarship applications from aspiring pilots who looked like him, and policy recommendations for international legislation extending passenger civil rights protections to every form of commercial transportation worldwide. The work continued across borders and industries. The transformation was spreading internationally. The accountability was becoming systematic rather than exceptional. Justice Marcus Washington had proven conclusively was not just morally necessary in an interconnected world where individual experiences could become global conversations within hours. It was economically essential for institutions that wanted to survive contact with people who possessed resources to impose consequences proportional to the harm they inflicted. The lesson was worth exactly $687 million to teach, and every dollar had been invested wisely in creating a future where human dignity was valued properly as the most important currency of all. If this story moved, you don't just scroll past. Share it with someone who needs to understand that dignity isn't earned through documentation. It's owed through humanity. Real change happens when people with power choose to use it for justice. And when witnesses refuse to stay silent when they see discrimination happening in front of them. Where in the world are you reading from? And what would you have done if you'd been a passenger on that flight? Your voice matters. Your courage matters. Your choices matter. Subscribe, share, and remember, in a world where every interaction can become global news, within minutes, the cost of treating people with disrespect based on assumptions rather than facts is no longer sustainable for any institution. Choose dignity. Choose justice. Choose to be better than the comfortable prejudices that cost Skyline Airways $687 million to learn. The price of discrimination is exactly what Marcus Washington proved it to be, more than any company can afford to pay in the modern world.